Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It started about a week ago. I was sitting on my couch, watching TV, when I heard this noise from the house next door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal outside. It was this slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across a floor. It stopped after a few minutes, so I didn't think much of it. But then it happened again the next night. I was lying in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I heard it. The same dragging noise. This time, it was louder. It sounded like it was coming from inside my neighbor's house. I tried to ignore it. Maybe they were moving furniture or something. People do that, right? But it was almost midnight. Who moves furniture that late? I didn't know my neighbors all that well. The husband, Dave, was a quiet guy. I'd see him mowing the lawn or working on his car sometimes, but he never said much. His wife, Karen, was friendlier. She'd wave and say hello, but that was about it. They didn't seem like the kind of people who'd be making a ruckus at night. By the third night, the noise had changed. It wasn't just a dragging sound anymore. I could hear thumps. Heavy, deliberate thumps, like something being dropped or slammed. It made me uneasy. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but it just didn't feel right. I told myself it wasn't my business. I didn't want to get involved. But curiosity got the better of me. The next morning, I waited until I saw Karen outside, watering her plants. I casually walked over, making small talk about the weather before I finally brought up the noise. Hey, have you guys been doing some late night renovations or something? I tried to keep my voice light. Karen froze for a moment. Just a split second, but I saw it. Her face tightened, and she shook her head quickly. No, nothing like that. Maybe you're hearing the wind? It gets pretty loud sometimes. I didn't press her. She looked nervous, and I didn't want to make her uncomfortable. But that night, the noise came back. Louder than ever. It wasn't just dragging and thumping this time. I heard something else. It was muffled, but I could swear I heard what sounded like a voice. I couldn't sleep. I paced my living room, peeking through the blinds at their dark house. Every light was off, but the noises continued. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check. I threw on a jacket and walked over. My stomach was in knots, and my hands were sweaty. I stood at their door for a minute, trying to convince myself to go back home. But then I heard it again. A low, guttural noise from inside. My heart pounded as I knocked. It took a while, but finally, the door opened a crack. Karen stood there, her eyes wide and startled. She looked exhausted. Her hair was messy, and her face was pale. Sorry to bother you, Karen, but I've been hearing noises, I stammered. It's been going on for days. I just wanted to make sure everything's okay. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked behind her for a moment before she forced a smile. Everything's fine. Dave's not home. Business trip. Maybe you're just imagining things. But I wasn't. I knew I wasn't. Karen, I swear I heard something just now. Are you sure you're all right? She nodded, too quickly. I'm fine. Thanks for checking. And with that, she shut the door. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, The air felt thick, like something was wrong. But what could I do? She said she was fine. I had no reason to push further. But that night, the sounds came back. And this time, there was no mistaking it. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then, a loud bang. It echoed through the night, rattling my windows. I called the police. I didn't know what else to do. I told them about the noises, about how I was worried something was wrong. They said they'd send someone over to check. When the officers arrived, I watched from my window as they knocked on Karen's door. She answered, calm and composed, like nothing had happened. They spoke for a few minutes before leaving. One of the officers came over to my house to let me know they didn't find anything suspicious. She said her husband really is out of town. She seemed fine, the officer told me. If you hear anything else, give us a call. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I decided to do something I probably shouldn't have. While Karen was out, I walked around the side of their house. Their backyard had a tall privacy fence, but there was a small gap where I could see through. That's when I noticed the basement window. It was boarded up, sloppily, with uneven pieces of wood nailed across it. And beneath the boards, I could see something smeared on the glass. It looked dark, like dried blood. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police again, but what would I even say? I had no proof, just a bad feeling in a boarded-up window. That night, I hardly slept. Every creak and groan of my house made me jump. I thought I heard footsteps outside my window at one point, but when I looked, there was nothing there. And then, just before dawn, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, mind your own business. Asterisk. I moved out 2 days later. I needed a plumber. The sink in my kitchen had been dripping for weeks, and I kept putting it off. I should have just called someone sooner. I found a guy online, local, good reviews. His name was Mark. He picked up on the second ring, said he could come by that afternoon. Showed up right on time. He was older, maybe mid-50s, wearing a blue work shirt and jeans. He had this big tool bag slung over one shoulder. Smiled a little too wide when he introduced himself. Nice place, he said as I let him in. It wasn't. Just a small house, rental, nothing special. He set his bag down next to the sink, started taking out tools. He looked around as he worked, like he was taking it all in. I felt uneasy but told myself I was overreacting. You did some work on this place, huh? He said, tightening something under the sink. I hadn't. No, it's the same as when I moved in, I said. He nodded, but something about his face didn't sit right with me. Like he knew something I didn't. He kept working, muttering under his breath. I stayed close, watching. Something about him felt off. He moved like he knew the space too well. You painted the bedroom, though, he said. I froze. No, I didn't, I said. He looked up at me from under the sink, wiping his hands on a rag. Ha, he said. Guess I was thinking of something else. I forced a laugh, but my stomach turned. He went back to work, but I wasn't at ease anymore. A few minutes later, he spoke again. They ever fix the window in the back? He asked. I swallowed. What window? I said. He didn't look at me. just kept working. Last time I was here, one of the back windows had a crack in it, he said. He hadn't been here before. I knew that for a fact. You must be thinking of another place, I said. My voice sounded wrong. He paused. Yeah, he said. Must be. I watched him closely after that. He worked slower, like he was stalling. Kept glancing at me. I started feeling trapped, like I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. Finally, he stood up. All done, he said. Should be good now. I wanted him gone. I fumbled with my phone, pretending to check something. My hands felt numb. He packed up his tools, slung the bag over his shoulder. Before he left, he turned to me. You be careful, he said. Neighborhood's changed a lot. He smiled. The same too-white smile. Then he walked out the door. I locked it behind him, every bolt, every chain. I stood there, listening. His truck started up, but he didn't pull away right away. He sat there for a minute. Then, finally, he left. I turned around, looked at the sink. The dripping was worse than before. I grabbed my phone and called another plumber. One I knew. One I trusted. He came the next morning. When he looked under the sink, he frowned. You said someone worked on this yesterday? He asked. Yeah, I said. He didn't say anything for a second. Well, they weren't fixing it, he said. Looks like they were messing with it. My blood ran cold. I had no idea what Mark had been doing under my sink. I was walking home from work late. It was one of those nights when the streetlights barely did their job and the sidewalks were mostly empty. The only sound was the hum of distant cars and my footsteps. I've done that walk 100 times, but something about that night felt different. It wasn't cold, but I felt tense, like the air itself was pressing down on me. About halfway home, I saw a man standing at the corner. He was tall, thin, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans. Nothing unusual, but he stood there like he was waiting for something. I slowed a bit, thinking I could cross the street, but as soon as I hesitated, he stepped forward. Hey, man, he called. I need a favor. My phone's dead. Can I borrow yours for a quick call? It's an emergency. I don't usually help strangers like that, but he didn't look dangerous. His voice was calm, not frantic. I figured maybe his car broke down or something. I took my phone out of my pocket and handed it to him. He nodded, mumbling thanks, and started dialing. I noticed how he didn't even check the number. He just punched it in like he knew it by heart. I thought maybe he was calling a family member, but then my phone buzzed in my other pocket. My heart jumped. I didn't want to believe it. I grabbed it and saw the screen. My number was calling me. Hey, I said, trying to stay calm. Why are you calling my phone? He didn't answer. He just stood there, holding my phone to his ear, staring at me. Then he smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that made my stomach twist. I reached for the phone, but he jerked away. Relax, he said. Just making sure it's working. Give it back, I snapped. He held it up like he was considering it. Then, without warning, he ended the call and tossed my phone back to me. It clattered to the ground, and I scrambled to pick it up. When I looked up, he was already walking away. I thought about yelling after him, but my mouth was dry. My hands shook. I checked my phone, but there were no missed calls. Nothing in the call log. Like it never happened. The rest of the walk home was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting him to be there. But he wasn't. I locked my door and double-checked it. Every window. Every lock. My apartment felt suffocating, but I didn't dare leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. The way he looked at me. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another call. Nothing came. By morning, I convinced myself it was just some sick joke. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it was a glitch. I tried to move on, but the uneasy feeling stuck with me. A few days later, I was at a coffee shop when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I didn't answer. A minute later, it buzzed again. Same number. I blocked it. But then it kept happening. Different numbers every time. The calls never stopped. No voicemails. No messages. Just the buzzing. At night, I hear it vibrating on my nightstand. I started keeping it on silent, but that didn't help. It felt like the phone was daring me to answer. One night, I gave in. I picked up. Nothing. Just silence. But it wasn't empty. I heard breathing. Slow, steady. Like someone was waiting. I hung up. I called my phone provider the next morning. They said the numbers couldn't be traced. Spoofed, probably. They suggested changing my number. I did, but it didn't stop. The calls came to the new number. Always late at night. Always silence. I stopped going out after dark. I kept my curtains closed. I barely left the apartment. Then the text started. The first one came around midnight. Just one word, watching. The second one came the next night. Closer. I tried to report it. The police took down the details but didn't seem too concerned. Probably some kid messing around, they said. But I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound. My phone buzzing. I didn't check it. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. Then I heard something else. The creak of floorboards. Not from my apartment. From the hall outside my door. I froze. I didn't dare move. My phone buzzed again. Then again. The calls wouldn't stop. The sound in the hall did. I stayed like that until morning. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. But taped to my door was a note. 4 words in smudged black ink. I know your name. I packed a bag and left. Stayed in a motel across town for a few nights. Eventually, the calls stopped. I changed my number again. Got a new phone. It's been months. I don't walk alone at night. I keep my curtains closed. I'm careful now. Always watching. Because I know that whoever it was, they're still out there. And they know how to find me. I hadn't seen Heather in years. We used to be close, but life happened. I got busy with work, she moved out of state, and we just stopped talking. When she messaged me saying she'd be in town for a few days and wanted to catch up, I thought, why not? She arrived right on time, all smiles like no time had passed. We hugged at the door, and I led her into the kitchen. I'd spend most of the day cooking. Chicken, roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine on the table. She complimented how nice everything looked, said the house was beautiful. We sat down, and I poured us each a glass. The first few minutes were normal. Small talk about her job, her flight. She said she'd been staying at a hotel nearby but was thinking of visiting some old spots from when we were younger. Then it shifted. She smiled, tilting her head a little. I wonder if the old tree swing is still in your parents' backyard. I blinked. It was a strange thing to say. My parents had taken that swing down years ago, and I couldn't remember ever mentioning it to her. Oh, I don't think it's there anymore, I said. But it's funny you remember that. Heather laughed softly. Of course I do. We spent so much time there. You always wore that green dress with the little sunflowers on it. I froze. The sunflower dress. I hadn't thought about it in forever. It was a gift from my grandmother when I was 8. I loved that dress. Wore it until it didn't fit anymore. But there was no way Heather would know about it. We didn't meet until I was a teenager. How did you know about that dress? I asked, trying to sound casual. She shrugged. You must have told me once. I didn't press it. Maybe I had. Memories blend together sometimes. We kept talking, but it happened again. She brought up my old dog, Lucy, and the day she passed. I never talked about that with Heather. And then she mentioned the time my brother broke his arm falling off his bike. I remembered standing in the driveway, crying while my mom called for an ambulance. Heather described it like she was there. That must have been so scary, she said, her voice low. Hearing him scream like that. I couldn't breathe. She was right. He did scream. It echoed through the whole neighborhood. But I never told her that. I set my wine glass down, my hands trembling. Heather, how do you know these things? She smiled again. Calm. Almost amused. I know a lot about you. I tried to laugh it off. Okay, but seriously. It's like you're reading my mind. She didn't respond. Just sipped her wine. I kept thinking back, trying to remember any time I might have shared those stories. Maybe I'd posted something online. Maybe my mom told her once, though that didn't seem likely. But none of it made sense. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. I always loved that little music box you had on your nightstand, she said. The one with the pink ballerina. It used to get stuck sometimes. The song would slow down, like it was dying. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. Heather, you were never in my room. I never had you over. That music box was gone before I even met you. She stayed seated. Calm. Her eyes followed me like I was the one acting strange. I remember it, she said, her voice soft. You used to wind it up every night before bed. I could hear it through the walls. I shook my head. What are you talking about? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for her fork like nothing had happened. This chicken is really good. You always were a great cook. I could barely swallow. My hands were still trembling, and I couldn't shake the thought racing through my head. I think you should go, I said, trying to sound firm. I don't know what this is, but it's not funny. Heather's face didn't change. She set her fork down, folded her hands neatly. I'm sorry if I upset you, she said. I just wanted to see you again. It's been so long. But it wasn't long. Not in the way she meant. It wasn't nostalgia or reminiscing. It was something else. Something deliberate. She stood up slowly, pushing the chair back without a sound. "Thank you for dinner." I didn't follow her to the door. I couldn't. My legs felt too weak. She left without another word, and the second the door shut, I locked it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice. I tried to convince myself I misunderstood. Maybe I mentioned those things at some point and forgot. Maybe it wasn't as strange as it seemed. But then I checked my phone. No messages from her. No record of her contacting me. I checked social media, scrolled through our old conversations. The last time we talked was years ago. There was no recent message, no invitation for dinner. And when I checked the security camera by my front door, my stomach sank. There was no footage of her arriving. No footage of her leaving. The only thing the camera caught was me, standing in the doorway, holding it open, talking to no one. When I first moved into the house, it was nothing special. A small two-bedroom place with beige walls and a sagging porch. It was cheap, though, and close to work. That was good enough. The landlord didn't ask much. Month-to-month lease, cash preferred. He said he liked to keep things simple. Fine by me. I wasn't thrilled about getting a housemate, but rent wasn't doable on my own. His name was Chris. Showed up a couple of days after I moved in with a duffel bag and a folded-up futon. He was a quiet guy, a little awkward. Not much eye contact, and when he spoke, it was always in short sentences. We didn't talk much. Just hey in the morning, maybe a nod if we crossed paths in the kitchen. He didn't seem like a bad guy, though. Paid his half on time. Clean enough. He had this one chair in his room, an old leather recliner that looked out of place with the rest of his stuff. That's where he spent most of his time. I hear the soft creak of it whenever I walk past his door. After a couple of weeks, it got easier. I stopped thinking about the fact that I was living with a stranger. Most days, I barely noticed him. Then one evening, I came home from work, and the house was too quiet. No sound of the recliner. No faint hum from his TV. I knocked on his door. Nothing. It wasn't locked. I pushed it open a little, half expecting him to be sitting in that chair. But the room was empty. Not just empty, bare. No futon, no chair. No duffel bag. The walls were blank, and the closet door was wide open, empty hangers still swinging slightly like someone had just brushed past them. My first thought was that he'd moved out. Maybe something happened. Maybe he had to leave quickly. But it didn't make sense. He didn't mention anything about moving. There was no note. And the rent for the month was already paid. I called the landlord. "Chris," he asked after I explained. "I don't know any Chris." That didn't sit right. "My housemate," I said. "The guy renting the other room. You signed off on him, remember?" There was a pause. Then he said, "I only rented that place to you." I hung up without arguing. I figured he was either confused or lying. Maybe Chris had some kind of arrangement I didn't know about. It was weird, but not impossible. I tried calling Chris. Straight to voicemail. I checked for anything he might have left behind. Nothing. Not a sock, not a piece of trash. Like he never lived there at all. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, thinking, It was stupid, but part of me started wondering if I had gotten his name wrong. Maybe it wasn't Chris. Maybe I just assumed. But no, I remembered seeing his name on the Venmo payment when he sent me his half of the rent. Chris Bennett. That was real. The next day at work, I asked a couple of friends if they remembered me talking about my housemate. They gave me blank looks. One of them even laughed, like I was messing with him. "You live alone," he said. "You've lived alone since you moved in." I didn't argue. There was no point. That evening, I went back to the house. The door to his room was still open. The walls looked even more bare than before, like the absence of his things had made the emptiness worse. I stood there for a while, then finally went to my own room. But something had changed. I noticed it when I went to bed. The blankets didn't feel right. They smelled like detergent, but not the brand I used. They were tucked too tightly, the kind of way people do in hotels. I stared at the ceiling, every nerve in my body telling me that something was wrong. Then, just as I started drifting off, I heard it. A creak. It wasn't loud, but I knew exactly what it was. The sound of a chair. Leather shifting. I sat up, heart pounding. My eyes adjusted to the dark, but there was nothing there. Just the hum of the fridge from the kitchen. The noise didn't come again. The next day, I searched. Every corner of the house. Checked the attic. The crawl space. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That someone still was. I stopped sleeping in my room. Moved to the couch. Every little sound set me on edge. I hear footsteps on the porch, but when I checked, no one was there. I started keeping the TV on all night, just for the noise. I tried calling the landlord again. No answer. I drove to the address on the lease, but it was just an empty lot. Nothing but weeds and broken glass. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of something scraping, like wood dragging across the floor. I couldn't move. Couldn't even breathe. It came from down the hall, from his room. Slow and deliberate. Then it stopped. I didn't check. I didn't want to know. I sat there, clutching the blanket, until the first light of morning. The next day, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone. Didn't cancel the lease. I just drove. It's been months now. I've moved across the state. Found a new place, a small apartment with too much noise from the street. But I don't mind it. Silence is worse. Sometimes, though, I still hear it. That faint creak. Like someone shifting in an old leather chair. I've never been the type to notice people, not really. I go about my days, do my own thing, and stay in my lane. It's always been like that. But after it happened, I can't seem to stop noticing things anymore. Or people. I guess it started a few months ago. I work from home, so I usually take a break in the afternoons and head to this coffee shop down the street. It's small, a little old-fashioned, but cozy. The kind of place that doesn't rush you out the door, so I've always liked to go there. I get my iced latte, grab a seat by the window, and check emails or read for a bit. At first, it was just the usual crowd, a few college students, a couple of moms with toddlers, people who needed a pick-me-up, like me. There was one man who always sat in the same seat by the far wall. I never paid him much attention, though. He was one of those quiet types, the kind of guy who didn't cause any trouble, didn't make a fuss. He was probably in his mid-30s, had dark hair, maybe a little bit graying at the temples, and always wore a button-up shirt, even on the weekend. I had noticed him a couple of times, but he didn't stand out. He didn't really do anything remarkable. He'd sit, drink his coffee, and stare out the window. Sometimes he'd read, sometimes just watch people walk by. I don't know, nothing that would make you think twice about him. But then, one day, it happened. I walked into the shop, and he was already sitting in his usual spot. I ordered my drink and sat down at the table by the window, like I always did. After a few minutes, I felt someone standing nearby. I looked up and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his coffee cup in hand. "Hey," he said. "You're Emily, right?" I froze. I didn't know this guy, but he was looking at me like he expected me to recognize him. His eyes had this intensity to them, like he was waiting for some sort of response. I shook my head. "Sorry, I don't think I know you." His face didn't change. He seemed unfazed, like it was just a casual thing to say. No. We went to high school together," he said, his voice soft but confident. Now, I'm not the type to be rude, but I couldn't help the uncomfortable feeling creeping up my spine. High school? I didn't recognize this guy. I didn't remember him, not in the slightest. I had been at a small high school, but I had a good memory, especially when it came to faces. And I definitely didn't remember him. "I'm sorry, I really don't remember you," I said, trying to smile, trying to keep it polite. He didn't seem put off by my response. In fact, it almost seemed like he was expecting it. He pulled up the chair across from me and sat down. "It's okay," he said, almost like he was talking to himself. "I guess I didn't expect you to recognize me. We didn't really talk back then, but I remember you." My heart skipped a beat. "Ah, okay," I said. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, but It was the last year of high school," he interrupted, leaning forward a little. "You had that chemistry class with Mr. Jennings. Remember? We sat near each other. You always wore that blue sweater." I stared at him, trying to pull up anything. Blue sweater? Chemistry class? I didn't remember any of it. It was almost like my brain couldn't connect the dots. "I'm really sorry," I said again, my voice a little quieter now. "I don't remember." He seemed to notice the change in my tone, but instead of backing off, he leaned in just a little more, like he was trying to get me to remember. "I was the guy who always sat in the back," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "You glance over your shoulder at me every now and then. I remember. You were quiet, but smart. You got along with everyone. You didn't have a lot of close friends, but you never seemed lonely. You were always the one who would answer questions in class." I could feel my pulse in my throat, beating harder with every word he said. Everything he described sounded like me, but it didn't add up. I couldn't place him. I was trying so hard to remember, but there was nothing. No face. No name. No moment where I could recall seeing him. I swallowed, trying to keep calm. "I'm really sorry. I don't know who you are." His smile didn't falter. "It's fine. You probably don't remember me because we never really talked. I've just always remembered you, you know? I used to watch you in class." That sent a cold wave over me. Watch me? What did he mean by that? "I've been seeing you here for a while now," he continued, as if that wasn't odd at all. "I always thought I should come talk to you again, but I guess it took me a while to get the courage. I wanted to say something, to ask him to leave, but I felt frozen. He was still sitting there, staring at me with those unnerving, almost familiar eyes. I glanced around the room. No one was paying attention to us. It was just me and him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice suddenly softer, like he was concerned. "Yeah," I said quickly. I don't feel well, actually." I stood up abruptly, grabbing my bag. "I have to go." He didn't move, didn't say anything as I walked out of the coffee shop. The door closed behind me with a soft jingle, but I still felt like he was there, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still staring at me through that window. I didn't go back to the coffee shop for a few days. When I finally did, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird conversation. But when I walked in, he was sitting at the same spot. Same seat, same cup of coffee. He didn't look up. He didn't even notice me. I ordered my coffee, sat down by the window, and tried not to think about it. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a lonely guy. But when I looked up a few minutes later, I saw him watching me again. His eyes never left me. And I knew that he wasn't the stranger I thought he was. He was someone I'd known before. Someone I couldn't remember. Someone who was now too close. I haven't been back since. I've always been the type of person who likes change. Moving to a new place every few years didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed it. It's not that I hated where I was, I just liked the excitement of starting fresh. That's how I ended up in the apartment I'm living in now. It's a small one-bedroom place, a little outdated, but I don't mind. The rent is cheap, and it's close to work, which makes it convenient. When I first moved in, the landlord handed me the keys and gave me a quick rundown of the apartment. He said the last tenants moved out about a month ago, but he didn't offer much more than that. I didn't ask for details. People move in and out all the time, right? The apartment is on the second floor of an older building. The walls are thin, but I got used to the noise after a few days. Nothing too strange at first. A few things felt a little off, though. Like the closet door wouldn't shut properly, and there was this one spot on the kitchen floor that creaked every time I stepped on it. But those were just minor annoyances. I didn't think too much of it. It wasn't until a week after I moved in that I found the photo album. I'd been cleaning out a box of stuff I didn't really need, going through old things, and came across the album in the back of a closet. It was a thick, leather-bound album, dusty and worn, like it had been sitting there for years. I wasn't planning on looking at it, but something made me flip it open. The first few pages were filled with pictures of a family, a man, a woman, 2 young children. There were pictures of them at a park, on vacation, at birthday parties. Normal family stuff. It didn't look like anything out of the ordinary. At first. But then I turned the page. There was a photo of a woman sitting at a table, smiling, with a glass of wine in front of her. She looked like me. I mean, exactly like me. I stared at the photo for a while, trying to make sense of it. The woman in the picture had the same hair color, same eyes, even the same expression. It felt strange. A little unsettling. I thought maybe it was a coincidence, but the longer I looked at it, the more I started to feel like something was wrong. I kept flipping through the album, and the more I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. There were photos of the family at various places, in their backyard, at the beach, even a family trip to a theme park. But some of the places looked familiar to me. I had been to a few of the same spots recently. The beach in one picture? I'd been there a couple of weeks ago, though I didn't recognize anyone in the photo. The backyard? That looked like the park just a block away from my apartment. But the one that really got to me was the last photo in the album. It was a picture of a man and woman, both smiling at the camera. They were standing in front of what looked like my apartment building. The same building I now live in. I knew it was the same because I recognized the details in the background, the brick, the windows, the trees lining the sidewalk. It was unmistakable. I felt my heart start to race. I closed the album and shoved it back into the closet, not really sure what I had just seen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days were strange. I couldn't stop thinking about the album. I kept going back to the picture of the woman who looked like me. Every time I walked past the closet, I felt a strange urge to open it again. But I didn't. Instead, I tried to put it out of my mind. I started focusing on work, on the things I needed to do around the apartment. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't stop thinking about the photos. I decided to visit the landlord and ask him about the family that used to live here. When I got there, he seemed a little surprised. The family, he repeated when I mentioned them. You mean the Johnsons? I nodded. Yeah, the ones in the photo album. He paused, like he was trying to recall something. Then he nodded. Oh, right. They were the last tenants. They moved out about a month ago, just before you moved in. Nice family. Really quiet. They didn't stay long. Why did they move out? I asked, though I wasn't sure why I was asking. I didn't really want to know. The landlord shrugged. Not sure. They never said. They just packed up and left one day. Left everything behind, actually. They left a lot of stuff. That's why the place was still furnished when you moved in. That was odd. I don't know why, but it felt strange. I hadn't noticed much furniture in the apartment. It wasn't like it was full of stuff, just the basics. I was about to ask him more questions, but he seemed distracted. You know, I still have some things of theirs in storage, he said. I could give them to you if you want. Some old furniture, maybe a few boxes of knickknacks. Might be helpful for you, now that you're getting settled. I smiled, but it felt forced. No, that's all right. I'm good. I left the landlord's office and walked back to my apartment, but I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. They left without a word, just packed up and disappeared. When I got back to my place, I didn't go straight to the closet. Instead, I decided to check the rest of the apartment for anything that might have been left behind. In the corner of the kitchen, behind the trash can, I found a small cardboard box. It looked like it had been moved recently. I opened it, and inside were a few random items, a couple of old picture frames, some books, a few kitchen gadgets I didn't recognize. Nothing too strange. But when I dug to the bottom of the box, I found something else. It was another photo album. I opened it carefully. The pictures were different from the first album, but they were just as unsettling. This album had pictures of the same family, the Johnsons, but there were more of them. More moments in their life. And in each one, I saw places I had been in the last few weeks. A cafe I visited. A park I walked through. Even a street corner I passed on my way to work. But there was one photo that stood out above the rest. It was a picture of the woman, the one who looked like me, standing outside my apartment building. She was smiling, but her eyes were different. There was something off about the way she was looking at the camera, like she was waiting for something. Or someone. I closed the album quickly and set it down, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. The pictures were too close, too personal. It felt like someone was watching me, like I was being followed. I didn't feel safe in my own apartment anymore. I spent the next few days avoiding the apartment, staying out as much as I could. But every time I walked past the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I'd turn around, half expecting to see the woman standing there, looking at me like she knew everything about me. And maybe she did. It was just another night out with friends. We'd gone to a bar downtown, had some drinks, laughed a little too loud, and tried to talk over the music. Nothing too out of the ordinary, except that I had an early meeting the next day, and I didn't want to be up too late. So, when the time came to call it a night, I told my friends goodbye and made my way to the curb to order an Uber. It wasn't a busy night, so I thought it would be quick to get a ride. I pulled out my phone and requested a car, then waited for a few minutes. The app said it would be about 7 minutes. As I stood there, I tried to shake off the alcohol, hoping I wasn't too tipsy for the ride home. The Uber arrived, just like the app said it would. The car was a black sedan, the type I was used to. It pulled up to the curb slowly, and the driver rolled down the window. He looked at me, nodded, and I could see his face vaguely in the dim light. He didn't seem particularly remarkable, just an older man, maybe in his mid-40s, with a tired face and a scruffy beard. I didn't think much of it, assuming he was just here to pick me up. I opened the back door and slid into the seat. The interior smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, but nothing overwhelming. Just that lingering scent that can't ever quite be gone. I buckled up and pulled my phone out, not really expecting to talk. It had been a long night, and I was ready to get home, put on my pajamas, and sleep. But then he spoke. "You heading home, miss?" he asked, his voice a little too casual, almost like he was trying too hard to sound friendly. I nodded, "Yeah, just home. Shouldn't take too long." The car started moving, and for a moment, everything seemed fine. The city was quiet, and the streetlights flashed by as we drove. It was a familiar route. I had taken Ubers in the area before, but something felt off this time. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was watching me more than he should have been. A couple of minutes passed before he spoke again. "Do you live alone?" I froze for a second, my fingers tightening around my phone. It was such a strange question to ask, especially so early in the ride. I was a little taken aback. I didn't like the way it made me feel, but I tried to shrug it off. Yeah, I live alone." He didn't say anything for a moment, just kept driving, but the silence felt heavy. Then, almost too casually, he added, "You don't mind me asking, do you?" I just find it interesting. I wasn't sure how to respond. It felt intrusive, but at the same time, maybe I was overthinking it. I shrugged again, trying to ignore the odd tension building in the car. "It's fine," I said, trying to sound dismissive, hoping he'd get the hint. Instead of dropping the subject, he kept going. "You ever had someone waiting for you when you get home? You know, someone who just shows up and surprises you?" My stomach tightened. I laughed nervously, thinking maybe it was just an awkward attempt at small talk. "No, not really. I prefer my privacy." He chuckled softly, and I couldn't tell if it was nervous or just strange. It sounded almost forced. "Well, you know, sometimes people can just show up out of nowhere," he said. There was a pause before he added, "Funny how the world works like that, huh?" The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Yeah, I guess. I trailed off, trying to break the tension. My eyes flickered to the app on my phone. The ride was taking longer than it should have. We were still on the main road, and my apartment wasn't far from the bar. It didn't make sense. I looked up again, and this time, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The meter wasn't running. The digital numbers usually ticked up in small increments, but this time, the screen was blank. It wasn't even on. I stared at the dashboard, my mind starting to race. The meter? I asked, my voice coming out a little too sharp. The driver gave me a quick glance through the rearview mirror. "Oh, don't worry about that," he said smoothly. "I don't run the meter. Don't need to, for someone like you." I felt my pulse quicken. "What do you mean, someone like me?" I didn't like how the words tasted in my mouth. He didn't answer right away. The silence in the car grew thicker. I could feel the pressure in my chest as I sat back, not sure what was happening, but the air felt heavy and wrong. The city outside the window looked blurry now, the lights passing faster than before. Another few moments passed before he finally spoke again. "You know, I've been driving these streets a long time," he said, his voice colder now. "I get to know people. I get to know the ones who come and go. And people like you, they always come back." I wasn't sure if he was talking about the city or something else. It felt like he was saying something much darker, something I didn't want to understand. I could feel my stomach churn, a sick feeling rising up inside me. "You know, I can tell when someone's just passing through. And you're not passing through, are you?" He glanced back at me again, and this time, his eyes lingered just a little too long. I could feel the blood drain from my face. The hairs on my arms stood up, and a pit formed in my stomach. Something was wrong. I needed to get out of the car. I pulled my phone out again, pretending to check the time, but I was really just trying to find the quickest way to get in touch with someone, anyone. I needed to tell someone where I was. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't the route to my place." He smiled in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold now. "We're getting close," he said, and his voice had changed. It was no longer friendly or casual, it was flat, almost like he was trying to force calmness into a situation that wasn't calm at all. "I just need to make a quick stop," he added, his smile stretching unnaturally wide. I didn't want to wait. I needed to act, and I needed to do it now. I couldn't sit here and let him take me wherever he wanted. I knew I had to get out of the car. Before I could think too much, I threw the door open and bolted. The car wasn't going fast, but it was fast enough for me to feel a surge of panic as I ran. I heard him shout something behind me, but I didn't stop. My heart was pounding in my ears, and my breath was coming in quick, panic bursts. I didn't look back until I reached the street corner and found a group of people standing outside a late-night convenience store. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, then turned around to see if he was following me. He wasn't. The car was gone. It took me a while to calm down, but I eventually made it home safely. I didn't want to talk about it to anyone. I didn't even want to think about it. But that night still lingers in my mind, and I haven't taken an Uber since. I've been driving for hours, maybe even longer than I should have. It was late, I was exhausted, and my back was sore from being stuck in the same position for too long. I was on a road trip, just trying to make it to the next town over, but after driving for what felt like an eternity, I knew I had to stop for a break. I was pretty much out in the middle of nowhere, just the endless stretch of highway, some trees, and dark, empty fields. A single rest stop came up on the side of the road, and I didn't think twice. I pulled into the parking lot and parked near the small building. There was nothing else around, no cars, no lights except for the ones from the rest stop itself. It was a strange place to be at that hour, but I figured a quick bathroom break and maybe a stretch would do me good. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in years, maybe decades. Old, gray brick, a flickering light above the door. But it wasn't anything unusual. Just a rundown rest stop like many others I'd stopped at during my travels. I got out of my car, stretched my legs, and made my way into the building. I noticed it was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear any voices, no sounds of people moving around. But again, I didn't think much of it. It was late. Maybe I was the only one on the road at this hour. I walked into the bathroom. It was old, grimy, even, but still, I didn't pay it much attention. I walked to the first stall, and the door was already cracked open. I stepped inside, and that's when I noticed something was off. The door didn't fully close. It kept sticking. I had to push harder than usual to get it shut all the way. I didn't think about it too much at the time. I just did my business, washed my hands, and was about to leave when I heard something. A noise, soft at first, but then it started to sound more like a scraping, a kind of dragging sound. It wasn't loud, but it was just strange enough to make me pause. I looked around, but the bathroom was still empty. No one else was in there. I stepped out of the stall, and when I grabbed the handle of the bathroom door, I froze. The door wouldn't open. I tugged at it, but it didn't budge. I pushed harder, trying to force it open, but the door wouldn't move an inch. At first, I thought maybe the lock was stuck or something. But no, there was nothing. It wasn't locked from the inside. It was just stuck. I gave it another few hard tugs, pulling at the handle, trying to jostle it loose. My heart started racing. I was getting more and more frustrated. There were no other sounds, no one else in the bathroom with me. No one at the rest stop at all, for that matter. My pulse started to quicken as I realized I hadn't seen a single person since I got there. I pounded on the door with my fists, calling out for help. Hello? Anyone out there? My voice echoed off the empty walls. But there was nothing. Just silence. I pounded harder, this time calling out louder. Hello? I need help. The door stuck. But still, nothing. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The place was completely deserted. How could no one be around? I stepped back from the door and looked around the bathroom, my eyes darting nervously to the cracks in the walls, the grimy floors. There was a small window near the top of the wall above the sink, but it was too high for me to reach. I could see the outside, just darkness and the faint glow of the lights outside. But no one was out there either. No cars in the parking lot. No movement anywhere. I pounded on the door again, this time with all the force I could muster. My knuckles hurt from the impact, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. Something wasn't right. I had this horrible feeling that the longer I stayed in that bathroom, the more dangerous it became. I shouted again, please. Is anyone out there? But no answer came. My mind raced. I kept trying the handle, pulling, pushing. It was like the door was glued shut. The panic started creeping in, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead. I felt trapped. Something about this whole situation was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was completely alone in this place. I turned around to survey the bathroom again, just trying to think of something, anything that could explain what was happening. And that's when I saw it. There, in the corner of the bathroom, was a small wooden stool. It had been pushed aside, tucked away in the corner as though someone had just been sitting there. But I hadn't noticed it before. I couldn't remember seeing it when I first came in. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down, at least for a second. I grabbed the stool, then moved to the door, trying to see if I could wedge it under the handle or use it to force the door open. I couldn't see any other way out. I slammed it against the door, but it didn't work. It was just as stuck as before. By now, my hands were shaking, my chest tight. The feeling of being utterly alone started to weigh on me. Where was everyone? Why hadn't anyone heard me when I yelled? I glanced at my phone. It was still in my pocket, but when I checked, I realized I had no service. The little bars on the screen were empty. I didn't know if it was the place or if something else was going on, but it was like I was completely cut off from the world outside. I grabbed the door handle again and gave it another desperate tug, but this time, it felt different. It didn't feel like it was stuck anymore. It felt like it was being pulled from the other side, like someone was on the other side of the door, holding it shut. My heart stopped for a moment. I jerked the door with all my strength and finally, the door opened. It slammed against the wall, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. My eyes darted around the bathroom, looking for any sign of anyone, but there was nothing. The bathroom was empty. It was just me, standing there, trying to catch my breath. I didn't stick around long enough to see if anyone was hiding. I turned and ran out of the bathroom, back into the rest stop, but the place was still empty. The air outside felt cooler, fresher, but the unease didn't go away. I didn't look back. I jumped into my car and drove off. The rest stopped fading into the distance behind me. I didn't stop again until I was miles away. Even then, the feeling of being watched, the weight of that strange silence, stayed with me. I still don't know what happened in that bathroom. Maybe it was just a bad combination of tiredness, isolation, and my mind playing tricks on me. But I know one thing for sure. I will never stop at that rest stop again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a group of friends escaping the stress of everyday life. A secluded cabin in the woods, far from the noise of the city. We figured it would be the perfect place to relax, have some drinks, maybe get a little hiking in. Nothing crazy, just a few days to unwind. We arrived late Friday evening, around 9 or so. The cabin was tucked away on a small plot of land, surrounded by trees and a few open fields. There was no one else around, just the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional bird call. It felt peaceful, even a little remote, but that's what we wanted. No distractions, no one to bother us. The cabin was old, but it had charm. Wooden floors, a big fireplace, a porch with rocking chairs, and a rustic kitchen. It felt like something out of an old movie, but I liked it. We all piled inside, grabbed our bags, and immediately started cracking open beers and unpacking. The night passed easily. We all sat around the fire, talking about old memories, laughing about stupid things, and just catching up. It was the kind of weekend we had all been looking forward to. The next morning, we woke up to the smell of coffee brewing and the sun pouring through the windows. The woods outside looked beautiful, peaceful in the early morning light. After breakfast, we decided to go on a short hike around the area. There was a trail behind the cabin that looked like it led deeper into the forest. We all suited up in our hiking boots, grabbed some water, and headed out. Now, I'll be honest. There wasn't anything too spectacular about the trail. It was mostly just trees, underbrush, and a few scattered rocks. The air smelled fresh, and the sun was breaking through the trees in spots, but it wasn't anything to write home about. Just a normal hike through the woods. We weren't far in when one of us, Sarah, decided she wanted to break off and do her own thing. Sarah had always been a bit of a loner, especially on trips like this. She liked going off by herself for a while to clear her head. She mentioned she was going to take a walk, maybe explore a little, and we all just nodded. We didn't think anything of it. She had done this before on other trips, gone off for a bit to just be alone. "Hey, don't go too far," I joked as she started walking away. "We'll be back at the cabin in an hour, so don't get lost." Yeah, she replied, flashing a smile over her shoulder. "I'll be fine. I just need some space." She wasn't exactly in a rush, but she quickly disappeared into the woods, her footsteps crunching the fallen leaves beneath her. The rest of us continued down the trail, chatting about random things, who's been dating who, old school stories, stuff like that. We weren't too worried about her. Sarah was independent and knew her way around the outdoors. But an hour passed, and she hadn't shown up. We shrugged it off at first. Maybe she had gone further than expected, or maybe she stopped to take pictures or just sit somewhere quietly. We weren't exactly in a hurry. But then it was 2 hours, and still nothing. "Okay, this is getting weird," Mark said, looking at his watch. "She should have been back by now." We started calling out for her, but there was no answer. The woods around us were silent, except for the occasional bird or rustling in the trees. I didn't want to panic, but it was starting to feel off. "Let's head back to the cabin. Maybe she's already there," Lisa suggested. She was trying to stay calm, but I could tell she was getting anxious. We all agreed and made our way back. The walk back felt longer than it had on the way in. The woods seemed darker somehow, even though it was still daylight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, like I was expecting to see her walking behind us, but there was nothing. When we got back to the cabin, Sarah wasn't there. We immediately started looking around the area. We called her name, walked along the trails, looked by the cabin, and even checked by the stream we had passed earlier. But there was no sign of her. No footprints. No sound of her calling back. Just dead silence. By this point, we were starting to panic. Sarah wasn't the type of person to wander off for this long without at least letting someone know where she was. We began searching the woods more thoroughly, splitting up in groups, retracing our steps. But no matter how far we went, we found nothing. No sign of Sarah. Nothing. That's when we found the footprints. We were near the edge of the forest when Mark called out, "Hey, look at this." I jogged over to him, and sure enough, there were footprints. Fresh ones. But they weren't normal. They were just wrong. The footprints were in the soft dirt, leading off into the woods. But they weren't spaced right. It was almost like they were too far apart for someone walking normally. And the further we followed the tracks, the more scattered they looked. It was like Sarah had been walking in a hurry, but not a normal hurry. There was something frantic about the way they were spaced out. We followed them for a while, hoping they'd lead us to her, but after about 20 minutes, the tracks just stopped. There was no other sign of her. No broken branches, no evidence she had stumbled or fallen. Just a set of prints leading into the middle of nowhere. I felt sick to my stomach. I didn't know what to think. I kept expecting Sarah to show up any second, laughing at us for overreacting, but she didn't. It was like she had just disappeared. We stayed out there, searching until the sun began to set. But we didn't find a thing. It was like the forest had swallowed her whole. There was no sign of struggle. No other footprints or anything. Just the ones that led off into the trees and stopped. Eventually, we had to face the fact that something was wrong, something we couldn't explain. We made the decision to call the authorities, but it didn't matter. No one could find her. We spent the rest of the night locked in the cabin, talking in hushed voices, trying to figure out what had happened. But the truth was, none of us had any answers. We never found Sarah. And to this day, I don't know what happened to her. I think about those footprints sometimes. I think about how they just stopped. How she just disappeared. I don't know if we'll ever get answers, but that's something I'll never forget. It started on a Wednesday morning, one of those quiet days where nothing seems out of place. I was home alone, working in my makeshift office near the front of the house. The neighborhood was still, with most people off at work or school. The only sounds were the occasional car passing by and the faint hum of the heater kicking in. Around 10 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Not a casual tap-tap, but 3 firm knocks. It startled me enough that I jumped, spilling some coffee onto my desk. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the doorbell hadn't rung. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. When I opened the door, a man stood on the porch. He was middle-aged, clean-shaven, and dressed in a plain button-up shirt and slacks. He carried a clipboard and wore a badge clipped to his pocket. The badge looked official enough, though I couldn't make out what it said from where I stood. "Good morning," he said with a polite smile. "Sorry to bother you. I'm with the city's survey department. We're conducting property evaluations in the area, and I just need to confirm a few details about your home." His tone was professional, his demeanor calm. There was nothing inherently alarming about him, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was how he kept glancing past me, like he was trying to look inside the house. "Ah, sure," I said, hesitantly. "What do you need to know?" He looked down at his clipboard and flipped through a few papers. "I just need to verify some basic information. Number of bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, things like that. It's for the city records." I hesitated. Wouldn't that information already be on file? His smile didn't falter, but there was a slight pause before he answered. "Sometimes the records aren't updated accurately. It's just a quick confirmation." I didn't love the idea of giving out details about my house to a stranger, even one claiming to be from the city. "Do you have any identification?" I asked, keeping my hand on the door. "Of course," he said, reaching for the badge on his pocket. He held it up, but not close enough for me to see it clearly. "See? Official surveyor. I can give you a contact number if you'd like to confirm." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. His badge looked generic, the kind you could order online. The name on it didn't match the department logo. My gut told me this wasn't right, and I decided to trust it. "I'm sorry," I said firmly, "but I'm not comfortable sharing information about my home. If you need anything, you can contact me through the proper channels." His smile faded, and his expression shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't anger, but something colder. "All right," he said after a moment, his tone still polite but clipped. "No problem. Have a good day." He turned and walked away, heading down the driveway toward the street. I watched him go, noting how he didn't stop at any of my neighbors' houses. He just got into a gray sedan parked a few houses down and drove off. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. The encounter didn't sit right, but I convinced myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was legit, and I'd just been overly cautious. Better safe than sorry, I told myself. That night, I locked the doors and windows as usual. I double-checked everything, even though I didn't always do that. It wasn't paranoia, I told myself, just being careful. The next morning, I found the back gate open. It wasn't broken or hanging off its hinges, just unlatched. I knew I had closed it the day before because I'd let the dog out after lunch. I always made a point to latch it afterward. I walked around the yard, looking for anything out of place. That's when I noticed faint footprints in the dirt near the side of the house. They were too big to be mine and too fresh to be old. I knelt down to get a better look, and my heart sank. They led straight to one of the windows. The window screen had been tampered with. It wasn't torn, but it had been partially pried away from the frame. Whoever did it didn't get inside. The window was still locked, but the attempt was clear. Someone had been here. My mind immediately went to the city surveyor from the day before. His questions, his clipboard, the way he looked past me into the house, it all clicked. He wasn't from the city. He had been scouting my home, testing whether I'd be an easy target. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who came to the house listened carefully as I described the man and what had happened. He nodded as I spoke, his expression grim. "This isn't the first time we've heard about something like this," he said. "There's been a few reports of people posing as utility workers or city officials to gain access to homes." He took down all the details I could remember, the man's appearance, his car, the fake badge, and assured me they'd investigate. But there wasn't much they could do without more information. "Just be vigilant," he said before leaving. "If you see him again, call us immediately." For the next few days, I felt like I was living in a bubble of paranoia. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept all the blinds closed and checked the locks multiple times a day. I even installed a camera above the front door, something I'd been meaning to do for months but had always put off. Then, a week later, I spotted the gray sedan parked down the street again. It was the same car, I was sure of it. It sat there for hours, the windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone. I haven't seen the man since, but the experience has stayed with me. It's the kind of thing that makes you question everything, that makes you second guess every knock at the door. I still don't know what he was planning, but I'm grateful I trusted my instincts that day. It might have saved me from something far worse. It started out small, something I almost didn't notice at first. After my evening workouts at the gym, I'd see the same men hanging around the parking lot. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. The gym wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't the worst either. There were a few businesses nearby, and I assumed he was waiting for someone. He wasn't particularly striking, medium build, plain clothes, dark hair. The kind of person you wouldn't give a second glance to. The first couple of times, he was just there, leaning against a car or standing near the streetlight, looking at his phone. I didn't think much of it. But then I realized he was always there. It didn't matter what time I finished my workout, early evening, late at night, even on weekends, he was in the lot. He never came into the gym, never seemed to interact with anyone. Just stood there, always in the same general area. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he lived nearby, or maybe his car was broken down and he was waiting for help. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. One night, after a particularly late session, I came out of the gym to find the lot mostly empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, flickering glow. He was there again, standing near the same spot, just a little too close to my car. I hesitated, lingering near the gym entrance. My keys were in my hand, gripped tightly, the small canister of pepper spray dangling from the ring. He wasn't looking at his phone this time. He was watching me. I took a deep breath and started walking. The sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet lot. I avoided eye contact, keeping my head down, but I could feel his gaze. As I got closer to my car, he moved. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to keep calm. "Can I help you?" He smiled, a strange, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've seen you around here. Just wanted to say hi." I stopped a few feet from my car, keeping the vehicle between us. "Okay. Hi." His smile didn't waver. "You're here a lot. You must be really dedicated." I didn't know what to say to that. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to end the conversation without escalating it. "I guess," I said, glancing toward the gym. The front desk was empty. The girl who usually worked nights must have stepped out. "You don't have to be nervous," he said, taking a step closer. I tightened my grip on my keys, the pepper spray pressing into my palm. "I'm not nervous." He laughed, a low, uncomfortable sound. "I just thought maybe we could talk. You know, get to know each other. You're always in such a rush." "I need to go," I said firmly, taking a step toward my car door. He moved again, positioning himself closer, cutting off my path. "Just a few minutes." "What's the harm?" The smile was still there, but there was something in his eyes now, something sharp, predatory. I didn't answer. Instead, I unlocked my car with the fob and opened the door just enough to wedge myself between it and the frame. His expression changed, the smile slipping for a fraction of a second. "Hey, I'm just being friendly. No need to be rude." I slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors before he could say anything else. He stayed there, standing just outside my window, his face unreadable. For a moment, I thought he was going to walk away. But then he leaned down, his hands on the edge of the window. "You don't have to be like that," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. I started the engine, the sound cutting through the silence. His eyes didn't move from mine. As I pulled out of the parking spot, he stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. I drove out of the lot as quickly as I could, my hands trembling on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me go. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I called the gym and reported what happened. The manager assured me they'd look into it, maybe even review the security footage, but I didn't feel reassured. For the next week, I changed my routine, going to the gym at different times. But every time, I found myself scanning the parking lot, my stomach twisting into knots when I didn't see him and twisting even tighter when I did. It wasn't until a Friday night that things escalated. I had just finished my workout and was heading to my car when I noticed him again. This time, he wasn't standing near the lot. He was sitting in a car, parked a few spaces away from mine. As I walked past, the engine started. I didn't look at him, didn't slow down. My heart was racing, every nerve on edge. I got into my car and locked the doors, my fingers fumbling with the keys as I started the engine. The headlights of his car turned on. I pulled out of the lot, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. He followed. At first, I told myself it was another coincidence. But as I made turn after turn, he stayed behind me, always at a distance but never too far. I drove aimlessly, trying to lose him, but no matter where I went, he was there. Finally, I spotted a gas station up ahead, brightly lit with a few cars in the lot. I pulled in, parking as close to the entrance as I could. He drove past, his car slowing just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. I stayed in the station for almost half an hour, pretending to browse the shelves. When I finally got back to my car, he was gone. That was the last time I saw him, but it hasn't stopped me from looking over my shoulder, from checking the parking lot every time I leave the gym. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know I'll never forget the look in his eyes. I went camping alone because I thought I needed some quiet. The last few months had been stressful, and getting out into the woods felt like the only way to clear my head. I picked a spot at a state park I visited before, but this time I decided to venture deeper, away from the other campers. I didn't want to hear anyone else talking or their radios or whatever. Just nature. The first day was fine. I set up my tent by a small clearing near a creek. It was peaceful, just the sound of water and birds. By sunset, I was already feeling better. I cooked a small dinner on my little portable stove, cleaned up, and crawled into my sleeping bag early. The sounds outside were calming, and it didn't take long to drift off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was pitch black, and for a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined the noise. But then I heard it again. Something was moving outside the tent. It wasn't a small animal like a squirrel or raccoon. It was heavier. I could hear deliberate footsteps on the ground. Slow, deliberate. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a deer. They wander through campsites all the time, right? But then I heard the zipper of my backpack. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Someone was going through my stuff. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. I had forgotten to plug it into the power bank before falling asleep. My flashlight was near my feet, and I managed to grab it without making too much noise. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. I didn't dare turn the flashlight on. Instead, I just listened. Whoever it was, they were still there. I could hear them rummaging around. The clinking of pots and the rustling of plastic bags. My food bag. They were going through my food. My mouth felt dry, and I realized I hadn't thought this through. What was I supposed to do if it wasn't an animal? What if it was a person? The rummaging stopped, and for a few seconds, it was completely silent. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Then, there was a light tapping on the side of the tent. It was soft, almost playful, like someone running their fingers along the fabric. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed perfectly still. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Maybe if I didn't react, they'd get bored and leave. The tapping stopped, and I thought for a second they were gone. Then I heard the zipper of the tent. Not the bag. The tent. They were unzipping the tent. I panicked and turned on the flashlight, shining it directly at the zipper. I yelled, "Who's there? Get out of here." My voice sounded shaky, even to me. The light must have startled them because they stopped. But they didn't run. Instead, I saw a shadow outside. They were just standing there, their outline visible through the thin fabric. They didn't say anything, didn't move. Just stood there. I grabbed the only thing I had nearby that could be used as a weapon, a small hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood. I held it tight, my hands shaking. I'm armed. I yelled. I'll use it if I have to. The shadow moved then, but not away. They crouched down, their head now level with the tent. I could feel them watching me through the fabric. Then they said, "You shouldn't have come out here alone." Their voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't work. The shadow stood up again and walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. I waited, clutching the hatchet, for what felt like hours. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the tent. When the first light of dawn came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. My backpack was empty, its contents scattered everywhere. My food was gone, along with my wallet. The firewood I'd stacked up was kicked over, and there were footprints all around my campsite. I didn't waste any time packing up. I stuffed everything into the backpack, even though it was a mess, and left. I didn't bother following the trail back. I just headed in the direction I thought would lead me to the park entrance. It took hours, and I was exhausted by the time I made it back to the main road. When I got to the ranger station, I told them what happened. They didn't seem surprised. One of the rangers told me there had been reports of strange activity in the area lately, campsites being messed with, food stolen. They didn't have any suspects, but said they'd keep an eye out. I haven't been camping since. Every time I think about going back into the woods, I remember that shadow outside my tent and those words, "You shouldn't have come out here alone." It started with a package. I came home one evening after a long day at work and noticed it on my doorstep. It wasn't anything I was expecting, no delivery notices or anything. Just this small, nondescript box. The sort of thing you think nothing of, except for one thing, it had no return address. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was one of those mystery boxes people sometimes order for fun, or maybe someone had sent me something by mistake. But when I picked it up, it felt heavier than I expected. I stood there for a minute, turning it over in my hands, trying to figure out if I should open it or not. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't explain why. I decided to open it. There was no note, just a stack of photographs inside. I froze when I saw the first one. It was a picture of my house, taken from across the street. Not just any photo, though. This was taken from the angle of my front porch, the same angle I'd see if I were standing at the edge of my lawn. But I didn't recognize the camera or the hand holding it. There was no way I had taken this picture, but it was definitely my house. The photo was crisp, clear, almost unnervingly so. I felt a chill run down my spine as I flipped through the rest of the photos. Each one was taken from a different spot, but all from the same general area outside my house. One of them showed me standing in my kitchen, my back turned to the window, unaware of whoever was outside. Another showed me sitting at my desk in my office, again, not knowing I was being watched. The photos were not of anything that should have been publicly visible, things I thought were private moments. I looked through all of them, trying to make sense of who could have taken them and why. The photos weren't necessarily clear about what time they were taken, but I knew. I knew every single one of them had been taken when I was completely alone. And no one had been in my house, or so I thought. The moment I finished flipping through the pictures, I heard a sound. A knock at my door. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor, or someone trying to sell something. But then it came again, more persistent this time. Knock. 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 I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't move at first. My heart was pounding in my chest. The photos had made me feel like someone was watching me. And now, someone was knocking at my door, after sending me these images. My mind raced, but I couldn't figure out what to do. Another knock. This one was louder. Then a voice called out from the other side, low and calm but unmistakable. "I know you're in there." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My whole body felt frozen. My legs wouldn't move, and my hands were trembling so much I nearly dropped the box with the photos. My mind screamed at me to run, to lock myself in a room, but I couldn't make myself move. I heard the voice again. "You're not going to call the police, are you? They won't help you. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." I swallowed hard. What did that even mean? How did they know I had those photos? How could they have known I would be home at that time? The knocking continued, growing faster now, more insistent. "I know you're there. Open the door. You don't want me to come inside." I felt my legs finally give way, and I sank down to the floor. My hands were shaking violently now, and I held the photos tightly, as if somehow they would protect me or give me answers. I pressed my back to the wall and tried to think. My mind was clouded with fear, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get out. Get away from whoever was on the other side of that door. But I couldn't just leave the house. I couldn't abandon everything I had here. I couldn't just go out the back and run blindly into the night. Then, after what felt like hours, the knocking stopped. I didn't move. Not for a long time. I stayed as still as I possibly could, listening for any sounds. I tried to peek through the curtains without letting them see me, but everything was so quiet, too quiet. I knew the person, whoever they were, was still out there. I had to do something. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I needed to get to the phone. I needed to call the police. But what if they were watching? What if they were listening? I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally forcing myself to stand. I grabbed my phone, my heart still hammering, and slowly, quietly, I moved to the back of the house, staying out of sight. I called 911 as I opened the back door, stepped into the yard, and quietly closed it behind me. I ran, making sure to stay low, until I reached the neighbor's house. I didn't stop. I rang the doorbell, hoping they'd let me in. The neighbor wasn't home, but their car was in the driveway, so I kept trying. I could hear the sirens in the distance, but it felt like they would never reach me in time. It felt like an eternity before I saw the police lights flashing in the distance, but I wasn't about to wait any longer. The cops arrived shortly after. They didn't find anyone, of course. No one had been on my porch. No one had been near my door. But I was still terrified. When they asked about the photos, I showed them the box. They didn't know what to make of it. They told me to file a report, but they weren't optimistic. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. It was hard to forget those images. Hard to forget that feeling of being watched. I don't know who it was. I still don't. But I haven't seen that package again, and I haven't gotten any more strange knocks. But I'm still waiting, and I'm still scared. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that they're still watching. Still out there. I had just finished a long day at work and wanted to grab a few things from the grocery store before heading home. It was late in the evening, around 8:30 p.m., and the store was quieter than usual, with only a handful of people scattered around the aisles. I was tired but just trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. I didn't think much of the empty shelves or the dimmed lights, just focused on my list and getting home. As I moved through the aisles, something caught my eye. A man was walking just a few paces behind me. I didn't pay much attention at first. It wasn't unusual to see people in the same aisles when you're picking out groceries. But then it happened again. I rounded the corner to the next aisle, and so did he, right behind me, just a few feet away. It wasn't anything too obvious, but I started to feel watched. a little uncomfortable. I picked up a box of cereal and glanced over my shoulder. He was still there. Not directly looking at me, but I could feel his presence. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I moved on, heading towards the produce section. I reached for some tomatoes and noticed him again, only this time he was standing a little too close to me. I could feel the air shift, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly looked down at my cart, pretending to rummage through it. He was still there, and this time, it wasn't subtle. I kept telling myself to stay calm. This was a grocery store, after all. People shop, and maybe he was just trying to pick up some items too. But the way he was lingering was starting to feel wrong. I didn't recognize him from the store, and I couldn't remember seeing him earlier in the aisles. I kept glancing around the store, trying to see if anyone else had noticed him, but no one seemed to be paying attention. It was just the two of us, and I began to feel like I was trapped in some kind of vacuum, the space around me growing smaller with every step I took. I grabbed what I needed, trying to keep moving, trying to stay focused on my list. But each time I turned down a new aisle, there he was always just a few steps behind. Sometimes he would stop, pretending to look at a shelf, and then start walking again when I did. At one point, I reached for a bag of flour, and when I straightened up, he was right there. Too close. "Excuse me," I muttered, trying to sound confident, though my voice was shaking slightly. He just smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was unsettling, almost as if he knew something I didn't. "Sorry," he said, his voice flat. He stepped aside, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than was comfortable before he moved to the next aisle. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart started pounding in my chest. I hurried to finish my shopping, grabbing the last few items as quickly as I could, trying not to glance back. I just wanted to get to the checkout, get out of there, and go home. When I finally made my way to the register, I noticed the man again, standing in line a few spots behind me. This time, I made sure not to look back at him, but I could feel his presence, like a shadow on the back of my neck. I paid quickly, practically running through the checkout process. The cashier didn't seem to notice anything, or maybe they were just too busy with their own work. I didn't care. I left the store, trying to stay calm, to look casual. My mind was racing, and I could hear my footsteps echoing on the pavement as I walked to my car. It wasn't until I reached the end of the row that I saw him again, standing by his car, just a few spots over from mine. My stomach dropped. I couldn't remember what kind of car he drove, but there it was, a sedan with tinted windows, parked next to my own. I didn't know for sure if he was waiting for me, but something told me that he was. I stopped in my tracks. I didn't want to seem like I was panicking, but I could feel the dread creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just go back into the store. I couldn't go back to the register and make a scene. I needed to get to my car, but I was too scared to walk towards it now. I stood there for a moment, pretending to adjust my purse and looking around to see if anyone else was still in the parking lot. The place was nearly empty now. I could see a couple of cars far off in the distance, but no one close. The parking lot was eerily quiet. My pulse was thudding in my ears. I checked my phone quickly, no messages. No calls. I glanced back at the man. He was still standing there, facing away from me, but I knew he had to have seen me by now. He hadn't gotten into his car. He hadn't moved an inch. Just waiting. Watching. I thought about calling someone, but my hands were shaking. I didn't want to make any rash decisions and risk alerting him that I was onto him. I tried to breathe through the anxiety rising in my chest. I could feel the panic beginning to build, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, I stepped back toward my car, making my way down the row of vehicles, keeping my eyes fixed ahead of me. I felt like every step took forever. When I was just a few feet away from my car, I hesitated. Was he really going to do something? Was he just waiting for me to get close enough? I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I had to get in my car, fast. I reached for my keys, keeping my eyes fixed on his car. I unlocked the door and slid inside, locking it immediately. My hands were still shaking, and I could barely get the key into the ignition. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but the parking lot was empty. He wasn't there anymore. My heart was racing in my chest as I finally started the engine and backed out of the space. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It wasn't until I got inside my apartment and locked the door that I felt like I could breathe again. But even then, I kept thinking about that man. The way he followed me, the way he just stood there waiting by his car. The sick feeling in my stomach didn't go away until well into the night. I didn't go out again alone for the next few days. I stayed home, and even when I did go out, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching me. I don't know if that man was just looking for someone to talk to or if he had other intentions, but I wasn't willing to stick around long enough to find out. I'll never forget that day. It seemed like just another normal morning for a jog in the park, but everything changed the moment I stepped off the familiar trail. It was about 7 a.m. when I started my run. I've always enjoyed early morning jogs. It's peaceful, and the park is usually quiet at that hour. The air is crisp, the sun is just starting to rise, and there's something about the solitude that helps me clear my mind. It's always been a safe space, a place where I could just be. I know the paths by heart, the ones around the lake and the ones that loop through the wooded areas. It's never been a place where I felt nervous or concerned. As I passed the entrance to the wooded trail, I saw a man standing just off the path. He was pacing back and forth, looking down at the ground, seemingly anxious. I thought nothing of it at first. I'd seen other joggers and walkers before, so I kept going. But then I heard him call out, "Hey, excuse me. Can you help me out for a second?" I slowed my pace, not sure what he wanted. I looked over and saw that he was holding a leash, but there was no dog in sight. "Sure, what's up?" I asked, now slowing to a walk. "I lost my dog," he said. "I was walking him, and he ran off. I can't find him. Have you seen any dogs around here?" At first, I thought it was just an unfortunate situation. It happens. Dogs sometimes run off unexpectedly. The man looked distressed, but not overly panicked. I've always been a dog lover myself, so I felt a little bad for him. I figured I could help. "No, I haven't seen one," I told him, "but I can keep an eye out if you'd like. I'm headed down this trail. Maybe I can help you find him." He nodded quickly. "That would be great. I've been walking for a while, but I haven't had any luck." He didn't seem dangerous at first. Just a guy who'd lost his dog. I figured he'd be fine if I kept jogging and offered to keep an eye out while I did so. I knew the area well, and I didn't mind trying to help someone. The man fell in step beside me as we walked down the trail. I didn't think much of it at first. We chatted about random things, mostly small talk. He mentioned his dog was a golden retriever, which made me smile. I love those dogs. But then his questions started to shift. "So, how far do you live from here?" he asked, his voice a little too curious. I was caught off guard. It wasn't an unusual question in itself. Lots of people make small talk about where they live, but his tone made me uneasy. There was a subtle edge to it, like he was trying to find out more about me. "Oh, not far," I said, a bit cautiously, "just a couple miles from here." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. He just nodded and then asked another question, this time more pointed. "And who's waiting for you at home?" he asked, a little too innocently. I stopped for a moment, looking at him more closely. Something about the way he asked felt wrong. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something more unsettling. He was asking questions that didn't seem to fit into a casual conversation. It felt like he was trying to gather information, to map out my life. "Just my roommate," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Why?" He gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Just wondering." He said it so offhandedly, like it was a normal thing to ask a stranger. By now, I started to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a scene. We were deep in the woods now, far from the path where I could see the park's entrance. My jog had taken me much further from the familiar routes, and I didn't want to make any assumptions, but it was becoming harder to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. Then, he asked again. "So, how far do you live again?" This time, his question felt different, like he was measuring something, not just casually making conversation. I was still trying to brush it off as nothing, but the same pit in my stomach told me to pay more attention. "Like I said, not far. Just a couple miles," I replied, my tone now slightly sharper. He nodded again, but this time, he didn't speak right away. He just kept walking beside me, the silence hanging between us. I tried to push away the worry creeping in, but the more I walked, the more uncomfortable I felt. I kept thinking of the exit from the trail, but it felt too far. There was no one else around, and the trail was narrowing. Suddenly, I noticed that his pace had quickened. Without realizing it, I'd fallen behind a few steps. He looked over his shoulder, and for the first time, his expression was completely different. His face was taut, his eyes narrowed slightly as if he were sizing me up. It wasn't friendly anymore. It wasn't worried about his dog. It was predatory. I felt my heart beat faster. A little voice inside told me to be alert. I glanced around. I could hear the birds in the trees, the sound of the wind, but there was no one else on the trail. No one to see if anything went wrong. I had to get out of here. I started walking faster, hoping he would fall behind, but he matched my pace. He wasn't close enough to grab me, but I could feel him just behind me now. I turned slightly, trying to gauge the distance between us. "I really need to find my dog," he said quietly, almost too quietly, like he was trying to draw my attention again. "Can you help me look around this corner?" I stopped abruptly. "No. I need to get going," I said, turning back toward the path we had just come from. "I'm sorry, but I can't help anymore." I could feel his eyes on me. He didn't say anything, but he didn't move either. I was backing up now, my instincts kicking in, screaming at me to turn around and run. "I'll just leave you to your dog then," I added quickly, trying to put as much space between us as possible. And that's when he stopped following. He stood there, still and silent, watching me with that cold, calculating gaze, and for the briefest moment, I thought he might take a step toward me. But instead, he just stood there, his face expressionless. I didn't give him another moment. I turned and ran, as fast as I could, until I broke free of the trees and was back on the main path. I kept running until I was near the parking lot where a couple of joggers had gathered, and only then did I slow down. I didn't look back once. I didn't tell anyone at first. I thought it might have been a coincidence, that I was overreacting. but I can't forget the way his eyes looked at me, how he asked those questions that no one should ask a stranger in the woods. I don't know what his intentions were, but I'm sure glad I didn't find out. I haven't been back to that part of the park since. It started small, just a couple of times. I didn't think much of it at first, honestly. When I moved into this neighborhood, I knew I would eventually meet the people around me. It was a quiet street, a mix of young families, retirees, and single professionals. Everyone mostly kept to themselves, which was fine by me. I like my privacy, and I wasn't interested in becoming too close with anyone. But then I met Margaret, my neighbor from next door. At first, it seemed innocent enough. One evening, I was walking up the stairs to my front door when I saw her standing by her own door. She was a little older than me, in her early 50s, but friendly enough. She waved and came over to chat, something about how she'd noticed me moving in a few weeks ago. We made small talk. She told me she'd lived in the house for over a decade, and I gave her the standard response about being new to the area and trying to settle in. It wasn't long before she asked if I had a can of vegetable oil she could borrow. She said she was in the middle of cooking dinner, and she'd run out. I didn't think twice before I handed it over. "Of course, no problem," I said, handing her the can with a smile. She thanked me and promised to return it the next day. I didn't think anything more about it. That's just the kind of neighborly thing to do, right? The next day, at around 11 p.m., I heard a knock on my door. It was Margaret, holding the can of vegetable oil. "I'm so sorry, it got late," she said with a nervous laugh. "I just wanted to make sure you had it back before the night was over." I wasn't bothered by it. It was late, but she seemed like the type of person who wanted to make things right. "No problem," I said, smiling. "Thanks for bringing it back." Over the next few weeks, things continued like this. It was always something small, a cup of sugar, a set of measuring spoons, a screwdriver. She'd ask if she could borrow them, and most of the time, I'd say yes, thinking she was just being friendly. But then, without fail, she would show up at my door late at night, usually after 10 p.m., to return whatever she'd borrowed. It wasn't just the timing that started to bug me, though. It was the way she behaved when she came over. The first couple of times, it seemed normal enough. She'd knock, I'd answer, she'd give me whatever I had lent her, and we'd exchange pleasantries. But after a while, I noticed a pattern. She started lingering at the door longer than necessary. Just standing there, talking about random things. She'd mention something about her day, ask how my job was going, or bring up the weather in a way that felt almost rehearsed. It was always the same things, and it started to make me uncomfortable. Then came the night when it crossed a line. It was a Thursday, I remember. I had just gotten home from work and was preparing a quick dinner when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I opened it, I was surprised to see Margaret standing there. "Hey," she said with a soft smile. "I know it's late, but I just realized I've run out of tape. Could I borrow some? I'll return it tomorrow, I promise." I sighed, but it wasn't a big deal. I grabbed the tape from the drawer and handed it to her. "No problem," I said, trying to keep the conversation brief. "I've got to finish making dinner." But she didn't leave. She just stood there, almost as if waiting for me to invite her in. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, a little awkwardly. "Ah, well. I hope that helps." Instead of heading back to her own door like I expected, she stepped closer. "Actually," she said, her voice low, "do you mind if I come in for a second? I just need to use your bathroom real quick. I've been out all day, and I really need to go." Now, this was unusual. I had only known her for a few weeks, and while we'd exchanged pleasantries, I didn't feel comfortable with her coming inside. "Oh, I'm actually in the middle of something," I said, hoping she would get the hint. "Maybe next time?" She smiled, but it wasn't the same warm smile as before. It felt forced, like she was trying too hard to appear casual. "No worries. I'll just be quick," she said, before stepping over the threshold before I could stop her. I didn't know how to react. Part of me was saying this was a little too much, inviting herself in like that. But part of me didn't want to make a scene, so I just let it happen. I followed her inside, feeling this uncomfortable tension building in my chest. Margaret went straight to the bathroom without saying much, and I stood in the living room, trying to distract myself. A few moments later, she came out, not having said a word, and returned to the door. "Thanks again," she said, her tone a little too casual. "I really appreciate it." I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Something about her sudden invasion of my space felt off, but I was too tired and too uneasy to say anything. She left quietly, but that night, I didn't sleep well. The next few days were more of the same. Small things, small requests, and always returning them later than expected. Each time, she seemed to linger a little longer. The conversations felt forced, the air always thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her visits had become a regular part of my life now, and it was starting to get exhausting. I started avoiding answering the door when I knew she was going to come by. I pretended not to be home, even when I heard her knock. But it wasn't until one night that I realized just how far things had gone. I had just gotten home from a late shift and was exhausted. I barely had the energy to make a cup of tea when there was a knock at the door. I knew it was Margaret, and for once, I was too tired to be polite. I just let the silence stretch on, hoping she'd go away. But then I heard it, just the softest scratch against the door. It was so quiet I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. Then it came again. A small tap, followed by the sound of something sliding across the bottom of the door. I bent down to look. There, just below the crack of the door, was a small envelope with my name written on it in black ink. I opened it carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was a note. "I think I've overstayed my welcome," it said. "I'll be back tonight. Don't worry, I'll leave soon enough." I didn't know what to do. I had never felt so trapped in my own home before. It had been happening for so long that I hadn't even realized how much it had affected me until now. I had never asked Margaret to leave me alone, but I couldn't help but wonder if I had been too passive about it. If I had somehow allowed her to push past my boundaries, even when I didn't want her to. I still haven't figured out what to do about it. I've been locking the door earlier, avoiding her as best I can, but the tension is still there. Margaret still comes by every few days, and I've started noticing strange things, items out of place, things that I didn't borrow or use, and the feeling that someone has been in my house when I wasn't around. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that everything is normal. I don't know what will happen if I tell her to stay away. But I know one thing, I need to do something. Because the longer I wait, the harder it's going to be to make her leave. It happened about 6 months ago. I was working late, just trying to finish up some reports and get out of the office. I usually take the elevator down when I leave, don't really like the stairs, and the elevator's quick. This night, I was the last one in the office, so when I pressed the button, I was expecting to just ride down in peace and head home. But when the doors opened, there was a man standing inside. I didn't think much of it at first. He wore the maintenance uniform, dark blue with a name tag I didn't quite catch. I nodded at him, stepped inside, and pressed the button for the ground floor. I was tired, just wanted to get out of there. As the doors closed, he didn't press a button or say anything. I didn't think it was weird at first. Sometimes the maintenance people just ride along with you. But then, right as the elevator started moving, he turned to me and said, "We're gonna be stuck in here for hours." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Ah, really?" I said, glancing at the control panel. The elevator was moving fine, lights on, no issues. He didn't laugh. His face was serious, a little too serious. "Yeah," he said. "This thing always breaks down. We're gonna be here for a while." I felt my stomach tighten a little, but I tried to dismiss it. It wasn't unusual for an elevator to break down now and then, but it wasn't anything I needed to panic over. The building was well maintained. There was a slight shaking, a weird lurch, but the lights flickered, and everything stayed on. It seemed normal. The elevator kept going, and I noticed he wasn't looking at me. Instead, his eyes kept flicking back to the control panel, and then to the ceiling, like he was waiting for something to happen. Something about it made me uneasy, but I figured he was just a little on edge. Maintenance workers probably deal with all kinds of problems. But then the lights flickered again, and the elevator stopped with a jolt. I felt the sudden weight of the air in the small space. The floor indicator was still lit up, but the elevator wasn't moving. I pressed the emergency button, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching the panel. "Ah, are we stuck?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. I wasn't sure if I was more annoyed or scared. This wasn't a good situation, but I wasn't sure what to do next. He didn't respond immediately, just stared at the panel like it was going to fix itself. Then he looked up at me and said, "Told you. We're stuck. Could take hours." I didn't know what to say to that. I had assumed he was joking earlier, but now it felt real. I tried the emergency button again, but nothing happened. "Should we call for help?" I asked, still trying to keep my voice steady, though I was starting to feel the tension in my chest. He shrugged, like he didn't care. "They won't come. The system's down." That made no sense. The building had a whole emergency response system. There was no way no one would show up. The maintenance crew would be notified, and someone would be there within minutes, right? But this guy, he just stood there, his eyes fixed on the control panel. I didn't know what to do. I could feel the heat in the small space building, the air feeling thicker, suffocating. I glanced at the man again. His hands were clenched by his sides, and his breathing was uneven. I couldn't tell if he was scared or if something else was going on. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked again, trying to keep my voice firm but not make it sound like I was freaking out. "Is this some kind of joke?" His eyes snapped to me, and for a split second, I saw something in them, a weird, wild look that made my stomach drop. "You really think they'll help you?" he said, his voice suddenly low. "They won't. They'll leave us in here. It's always like this. It's always just the two of us." I laughed again, but this time it didn't feel right. "What do you mean, the two of us?" I asked, trying to hide how nervous I was starting to feel. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the control panel, messing with the buttons again. His hands were shaking, and for a moment, I thought maybe he was just as scared as I was. But then he looked at me again and said, "We're gonna be here for a while. Hours. Could be longer." His eyes locked on mine, and there was something unsettling about the way he said it. Like he knew. I didn't know if I should argue or just shut up. Something in the pit of my stomach was telling me that this wasn't a normal situation. I felt trapped, like I was in a tiny box with a man who had suddenly turned off. I glanced around the elevator, looking for some way out. But everything looked normal, besides the fact that we were stuck in a box with no way to reach the outside world. I pressed the emergency button again, but still nothing. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I felt it shaking. "What's wrong with you? What do you mean, the two of us? What's going on?" My words were coming out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. Something about the way he was acting, the way he was looking at me, made my nerves jump into high gear. He grinned, but it wasn't a friendly grin. It was empty. "It's just us now," he said. He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back. "Just us in here, waiting. We'll be stuck in here for hours." I don't know how, but I knew I had to get out of there. This wasn't just some malfunctioning elevator. This wasn't just a worker having a bad day. Something was wrong with him, and I needed to leave before it got worse. I didn't know how to get help or if anyone was coming, but I couldn't just stay there and let this guy get closer to me. I pressed the emergency button again, but this time I shouted into the intercom, "Help! I'm stuck in the elevator. Please, someone, help me." I don't know how long it was, maybe just a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, I heard someone on the other end, responding to my call. "We're sending someone right now. Stay calm." I didn't look back at the man. I just kept my eyes on the doors, hoping that the rescue crew would get there fast. And they did. The doors finally opened after what felt like forever, and I practically stumbled out of the elevator as soon as it did. I didn't look back at the man. I didn't want to know what he was doing or where he went. I just got out of there. I haven't seen him since, but I still get a sinking feeling whenever I have to ride the elevator. I don't think I'll ever forget the way he looked at me that day. It wasn't normal. It wasn't just a malfunction. There was something else. I still feel shaken when I think about it, and it's been weeks since it happened. I ordered a new washing machine after my old one broke down. It wasn't the most exciting purchase, but I was looking forward to getting it set up and not having to drag my laundry to the laundromat anymore. I called the company, scheduled the delivery, and everything seemed normal. It was supposed to be a simple transaction, just get the machine, set it up, and move on. The delivery was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon, and I was working from home that day. I made sure to be ready, figuring they'd come, drop it off, and be on their way. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The truck pulled up around 2 p.m., right on time. The delivery man was tall, wearing a uniform from the appliance company, and seemed friendly enough. He smiled at me when he got out of the truck, and we exchanged pleasantries as I showed him where I wanted the machine set up in the laundry room. I thought everything was fine. I really did. But then, after he unloaded the appliance, he said, "You mind if I come in and set it up for you?" I was a little taken aback because I hadn't expected it. I figured the company would just drop off the machine, and I'd have to handle the setup myself. But I didn't want to seem difficult, so I said, "Sure, I guess that would be helpful." I stepped aside to let him in. He carried the washing machine into the laundry room, set it down, and began looking around. He asked where the hookups were, which I showed him. Then, he started fiddling with the controls and asked me if I wanted him to connect it right away or if I'd rather wait. I said it was fine, go ahead, and I left him to it, figuring he knew what he was doing. That's when things started to get strange. As he worked, he began making small talk. It started innocently enough. You live here alone? He asked, glancing at me as I sat at the kitchen table, trying to get some work done. Yeah, I answered, just trying to be polite. It's just me. He nodded but didn't say anything for a while. Then, after a few moments, he added, Do you have a boyfriend? I looked up, surprised. The question seemed odd, but I brushed it off. No, I said, trying to keep it casual. Just not really into dating right now. He seemed to think about that for a moment, then nodded as if he was making some kind of decision. But then he said, I'm sure a pretty girl like you must have some guys after you. I didn't know how to respond to that. I'm not someone who gets a lot of attention, and the comment felt off. But I forced a smile and nodded, saying something like, Not really. He didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he kept on working, but he started asking more personal questions. Do you live alone because you want to? Or are you just, like, avoiding someone? I felt my skin prickle. His tone was different now. It wasn't just small talk anymore. It felt like he was prying, trying to get more information than necessary. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just a little awkward, but he kept going. You've got a lot of stuff here, he remarked, glancing around my house. Do you live here long? You seem settled. I've been here a while, I replied, my voice getting tighter. I wanted to make him finish up and leave, but I didn't want to seem rude. Then, he asked something I really didn't expect. Do you ever have people over? Or is it just you all the time? The question made my stomach twist. It wasn't the kind of thing someone should be asking a stranger in your home. My mind raced for a way to end the conversation, but before I could respond, he added, I don't want to sound like a creep, but it must get lonely sometimes, huh? I froze. Something wasn't right. He was still working, but his body language had changed. He seemed more focused on me than the appliance now. I started to feel uncomfortable, like he was sizing me up, watching me too closely. I couldn't explain it, but I had this gut feeling that something was off. I tried to change the subject, making some excuse about needing to get back to work. But instead of just nodding and finishing the setup, he paused. He stood up straight and looked at me, not moving. There was something about the way he stared at me that made my chest tighten. You're sure you're all right living here alone? He asked again, his voice lower now. I can't help but wonder, sometimes people need help with things. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I could feel my heart rate picking up. I didn't like where this conversation was going, and I really wanted him to leave. But I didn't know how to tell him without being rude. He was in my house, and I didn't want to cause a scene, but I was scared. I could tell he wasn't going to leave anytime soon. I stood up abruptly, my voice firmer now. Look, I appreciate your help with the machine, but I really need to get back to work. Can you finish up and head out? He seemed startled by my change in tone. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He nodded and turned back to the machine, but I could tell he was stalling. He wasn't finishing up like he should have. Instead, he took his time, moving slowly as if he was trying to prolong the visit. Almost done here, he said, but his voice sounded off. Just need a little more time. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over to the door of the laundry room and opened it wide. No! You need to leave now. He looked at me, his face unreadable for a second. Then, he grabbed his tools and walked out of the room without another word. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, just watching him walk out the front door. I didn't wait. As soon as the door closed behind him, I locked it. I didn't care if it was rude or not. I felt trapped in my own house. I don't know if he meant to harm me or if it was just an awkward, creepy encounter, but I was relieved when he finally left. The whole thing left me shaken. After that, I called the company to file a complaint. They were apologetic, but they couldn't really do anything since I'd already accepted the service. I've been extra careful ever since, making sure I don't let anyone into my house without a clear need. I don't know if I overreacted, but I can't shake the feeling that something bad could have happened if I didn't stand up for myself. I still get nervous when I hear someone knock on the door. It started like a regular Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished work, was feeling tired, and was getting ready to settle in for the evening. My phone rang at about 6 p.m., a number I didn't recognize. I thought it was probably a spam call, but I answered anyway. "Hello?" I said, not expecting much. The voice on the other end was shaky, panicked. "Is this Jeff?" "It's Mark, your cousin. I've been in a car accident. I'm hurt bad, and I really need your help." I froze for a second. Mark was my cousin, but we hadn't talked in a while. The last time I saw him was at a family reunion a few years ago. He seemed to be in a lot of pain. His voice was hard to recognize, and the urgency in his words caught me off guard. "Mark, what happened? Are you okay?" I asked, already reaching for my wallet just in case. "I don't know. I was driving, and some guy ran a red light. I don't have much time to explain. I'm at the hospital now, but I need money for the medical bills. I can't get out of here without it. Please, Jeff, I don't know what to do. They're saying I need to pay up front or they won't treat me. Please, I'm scared, man." I could hear him breathing heavily, and for a moment, it almost sounded like he was crying. I'd never heard him like this before, and I started to panic. Okay, just tell me where to send the money. I'll help you. Don't tell anyone," he added quickly. "I don't want anyone to know I'm in this mess. Just you. I trust you." His voice was full of desperation, and I couldn't think straight. I asked for his details, and he gave me the account number to transfer the money to. He said he'd explain everything when we could talk in person, but that he needed the money immediately or things would get worse. I didn't even hesitate. I sent the money. I just wanted to help, and I assumed it was a genuine emergency. I didn't think about how odd it was that I hadn't heard from him in so long, or that I'd never gotten a call from a hospital asking for money up front. I didn't think about anything other than getting him the help he said he needed. Once I transferred the money, I sat back, relieved. He promised he would call me again after he got out of the hospital, but he never did. In fact, I didn't hear from him at all that night. I assumed he was just dealing with the accident and the aftermath. The next morning, I woke up to a missed call from the same number. I checked my phone, and there was a voicemail from the same voice. "Jeff, it's Mark. They're saying I need more money. The bills are piling up, and I don't know what to do. Please help me out. I can't get out of here without it." I was confused. More money? I thought. He didn't say anything about more money the night before. But at this point, I was already too far in. I called him back. He picked up immediately, but this time, his voice was different. It wasn't the same frantic, scared tone from last night. It was colder, almost robotic. "Hey, Jeff," he said, like nothing had happened. "I need more. The doctors won't let me go without paying, and they're threatening to involve the police if I don't get them the money." "Wait, hold on," I interrupted. "What's going on?" You said you needed money last night. Why are you asking for more? There was a brief pause on the line before he spoke again, his voice still calm but with a hint of tension in it. I'm not sure what's happening, but they're saying they can't treat me unless I pay up. I don't know what else to do. Please, I'm stuck here. I hesitated. Something felt wrong. The change in his voice from last night to now, the way he seemed to be more focused on money than his condition, it didn't sit right with me. I decided to look into it. Mark, can you tell me the name of the hospital you're at? Maybe I can call them and confirm things, I said, trying to stay calm. There was another pause. Longer this time. No. I don't want you to call. Please, just send the money. I can't explain it all right now. Mark, this doesn't make sense. I'm calling the hospital, I said firmly. There was a long, tense silence before he spoke again. His voice sounded cold, almost threatening. You better not, he said, in a voice that wasn't at all like his. If you don't send the money, I'll make sure things get a lot worse for you. You don't want to mess with me, Jeff. I felt the blood drain from my face. The tone in his voice was completely different from the voice of my cousin. This wasn't Mark. It couldn't be. My mind raced as I started to realize what was happening. I hung up the phone and immediately tried to contact Mark's parents. I called his mother, but she didn't pick up. I left a voicemail asking if she'd heard from him, if he was really in the hospital. Then, I started Googling the hospital that Mark had mentioned. Nothing matched. I called the hospital directly, and they told me they had no records of him being admitted. I felt sick to my stomach. I went through everything again, trying to find any clue I had missed. I went back to the phone number. I Googled it. It was a prepaid phone, not linked to anyone I knew. That's when I realized I'd been scammed. But it didn't end there. For the next week, I kept getting calls from the same number. I blocked it, but the calls kept coming from different numbers. Sometimes it was the same voice, but sometimes it sounded like a different person altogether. They told me they knew where I lived. They told me they knew I was home when I wasn't. They threatened to hurt me, to hurt my family, if I didn't send more money. I had to get the police involved at that point. They told me it was a known scam, a common one where criminals pose as relatives in need of emergency funds. But the calls kept coming, even after I had reported it. They got more threatening, more aggressive. I changed my phone number, moved apartments, and took as many precautions as I could. But the feeling of being watched, of having someone track me, never really left. Even though I've been free from the calls for a while now, I still check my locks at night, still wonder if I'm being watched. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I thought I was careful. But this was different. It felt real. And for a while, it was my nightmare. I've been walking my dog every evening for years now, same route, same time. It's part of my routine, and honestly, it's something I look forward to. My dog, Charlie, is a golden retriever, so he loves it too. There's a park nearby, and I usually just go around the block and let him sniff around. It's never been anything special, just a quiet walk. A few weeks ago, though, something happened that's made me rethink even stepping outside after dark. It started on a Tuesday evening. The sky was getting that deep, dusky color, and I had Charlie on his leash as usual. We were just about to turn onto the main road when I noticed a woman walking toward me on the opposite side of the street. She had a small dog, a little terrier, which was trotting along beside her. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another person out with their pet. As we got closer, she smiled and waved, and I returned it out of politeness. She then said, "Your dog is really cute." "What's his name?" "Charlie," I said, holding up the leash slightly so she could see the dog's face more clearly. "Nice to meet you, Charlie," she said in this friendly, high-pitched voice. Then she took a step closer, and her dog gave a little bark in Charlie's direction, which made Charlie wag his tail and do that little dog thing where they both try to figure each other out. "Where do you live?" she asked casually, and I remember it catching me off guard a bit. I don't usually share that kind of detail with people I meet on walks, but it wasn't like she was asking for my address, just something vague, so I didn't think much of it. "Just a few blocks down that way," I said, pointing down the street, trying to keep the conversation light. I figured she was just being friendly. "How about you?" "Oh, I live just around the corner," she said, waving vaguely in the direction of a different street. "I don't think I've seen you around before. How long have you been in the neighborhood?" I told her I'd been living here for a couple of years. She nodded like she was processing that, then her eyes seemed to drift over my house for a second, but I didn't think much of it at the time. She asked a few more questions about my house, if I liked the neighborhood, if I had lived here long, what brought me to the area. I answered as best as I could without getting into anything too personal. It all seemed innocent enough, though I did feel a little weird with how much she wanted to know about my routine. After a few more minutes of small talk, she said, "Well, it was nice talking to you and Charlie. Maybe I'll see you again." I nodded and waved her off, and she turned and went down the side street, her dog trotting behind her. At the time, I thought it was just a friendly conversation. But over the next couple of days, things started to feel off. The following evening, I took Charlie out for our usual walk, but I noticed something strange. As I walked down the road, I caught a glimpse of her across the street, standing in the shadows of a tree. I wasn't sure if it was her at first, but when she stepped into the light, I could see her clearly. She was watching me. Just standing there, staring. I didn't think much of it at first. People go for walks, sometimes they just stand and look at things, right? But then I saw her again the next day, in the same spot, looking right at me as I walked by. I could have sworn she was waiting for me to pass by. By the third day, I started feeling uneasy. She wasn't just standing there anymore. This time, she was sitting on a bench, holding her dog in her lap, staring directly at me as I walked Charlie. I waved, but she didn't wave back. She didn't even acknowledge me. I started to feel that creeping discomfort, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just waiting for someone or passing the time. But then, it happened again. The next evening, she was there once more, standing at the corner of the street, watching me. It was like she was always there, at the same time, at the same spot. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching my every move. I started to hurry past, trying not to look at her. But one evening, when I was almost home, I glanced over and saw her standing across the street, staring at me again. I could feel my pulse quicken, my mind starting to race. I turned to look at Charlie. He was still his usual self, but I could tell something wasn't right. His ears were perked up, his tail wasn't wagging, and he kept glancing back at me like he knew something was wrong too. I decided to turn down another street, taking a longer route home, hoping I wouldn't see her anymore. But as I looked back, I saw her standing in the distance, right where I would have walked past. She wasn't just standing anymore, she was walking slowly toward me, her eyes locked on mine. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for the first time in a long while, I felt afraid. I could hear the sound of my footsteps on the pavement, the distant hum of cars passing, but everything felt so still. I picked up my pace, turning corners quickly, trying to distance myself from her. But I could feel her eyes on my back, following me. I didn't look back again after that. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I finally reached my apartment. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and drew the curtains. I didn't go outside for the rest of the night. It's been a few days since that happened. I've been keeping an eye out for her, but I haven't seen her again. I don't know if I'm just paranoid or if something's wrong, but I can't shake the feeling that she's been watching me for longer than I realized. I've tried telling a few people about it, but they don't seem to think it's a big deal. Maybe it's nothing, but I don't know. I can't forget those eyes staring at me, following me, like she was waiting for something. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe walking down that street again. I had never been a fan of street performances, but a friend of mine convinced me to go to one. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and the street was filled with people wandering about, enjoying the sunlight. A man was performing near the park, juggling and doing tricks that seemed to draw a crowd. I didn't expect much, just figured I'd stop by for a few minutes to kill time, maybe grab a coffee afterward. I leaned against a nearby wall, watching him for a bit. His performance was impressive, he was good with his tricks, and the crowd seemed entertained. But there was something about him that caught my attention. It wasn't just the way he moved or how skilled he was at juggling, it was the way he kept making eye contact with me. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just performing to the crowd, trying to make everyone feel like they were part of the show. But every time I looked away, I could feel his gaze on me, and when I looked back, his eyes were locked onto mine. It wasn't like he was being subtle about it, either. It was intense, almost too intense. It made me uncomfortable. After a few minutes, I figured it was time to leave, so I walked away and headed toward the cafe nearby. But as I walked, I could feel my heart racing for no reason. I told myself it was just the anxiety of being in a crowd, but something about that moment stuck with me. The next morning, I was at my usual cafe. It was a quiet Sunday, not many people around. I ordered my coffee and found a seat near the window. I wasn't expecting to see anyone I knew. But when I looked up, I saw him. The same man from the street performance was sitting at a table near the back. He was looking right at me, not in a casual way, but in the same way he had looked at me the day before. I froze for a second, unsure if I should make eye contact or look away. But he didn't look away. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, just like they had on the street. It felt like my chest was tightening. I got up quickly and left, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he liked this cafe too. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me somehow. The next day, I went to the gym. It was early, so the place was mostly empty. I did my usual workout, tried not to think too much about what had happened over the last few days. I didn't see him at first, and I told myself that maybe I was just overthinking everything. But then, as I was stretching on the mat near the back, I glanced up and there he was, standing by the weights, watching me. His eyes were fixed on me, just like the last two times. I didn't know if I should be scared, angry, or confused. My stomach turned. I tried to keep it together and not let it show that I was uncomfortable. But it was hard. I finished my workout quickly and left without really paying attention to what I was doing. I was in a daze, just wanting to get out of there. I convinced myself that he had just been a regular person at the gym. I tried to make excuses. But when I walked out, he was standing outside the gym, watching me. I didn't want to make a scene, so I hurried to my car, my heart racing. I locked the doors as soon as I got in. I tried to breathe, to calm myself down, but I couldn't. Something wasn't right. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Every place I went, he seemed to be there. I went to the grocery store, he was standing by the checkout. I stopped by a different cafe, he was sitting at a table near the window, staring at me. One day, I was walking out of my workplace, and I saw him across the street, leaning against a building, watching me. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It was like he was following me, waiting for me to notice, to acknowledge him. And each time, he would look at me with that same intense gaze. It felt like he was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a move, to say something, to respond. But I had no idea what he wanted. I started taking different routes home, avoiding the places I usually went. I didn't know if it was paranoia, but I started to feel like I was being watched constantly. Every shadow, every stranger's glance felt like it could be him. It became harder to ignore. One night, I decided to go out with a friend, hoping that a change of scenery would take my mind off things. I went to a bar in a different part of town, a place I'd never been before. It was busy, but I figured the crowd would make me feel safer. I wanted to forget the last few days, to just have a normal night. But as soon as I walked in, I froze. There he was, sitting at the bar, as if waiting for me. He turned and looked directly at me, that same intense gaze. My stomach dropped. I didn't know how he had found me, but there he was, like he had been there all along, like I was the one who was being followed, not the other way around. I couldn't handle it anymore. I told my friend I wasn't feeling well, and we left immediately. As we stepped outside, I turned to look down the street one last time. He was standing across the road, just standing there, staring at me. It was like he had been waiting for me to leave. I didn't know what to do. I didn't feel safe anymore. I started to think about moving, changing my routine completely, getting as far away from this man as I could. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step ahead of me. I don't know if he ever stopped following me, but after that night, I started avoiding going out at all. I didn't want to go to the places I used to visit, and even when I did go out, I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. He was always somewhere in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I stopped seeing him after a while, but the feeling never went away. I don't know if he was just a strange man with too much time on his hands, or if he was something more, but I haven't been able to forget about him. Every time I see someone glance at me a little too long, I get nervous. I keep thinking about those eyes, always watching, always waiting. It started with the scratching noises. It was subtle at first, almost like the sound of mice or squirrels scurrying around in the walls. I remember lying in bed one night, half asleep, when I heard it. A faint scratching sound from above. I brushed it off as nothing. We just moved into this old house a few months ago, and I assumed the creaks and groans of a house settling were just part of the charm. The first few weeks were uneventful, other than the occasional noise. But as time went on, it got worse. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was like something was moving around up there. You know that sound when you shift furniture or when something heavy drags across a floor? It started happening every night, at the same time. I didn't want to alarm my family, so I just shrugged it off. After all, we were in an old house. Pests were common, right? We dealt with some mice in the kitchen already, so it wasn't that big of a leap to think it might be something similar. Maybe a raccoon or squirrels had found a way into the attic. It wasn't the most pleasant thought, but it seemed harmless enough. One evening, about 3 weeks after we moved in, I was sitting in the living room with my husband, Dan, when we both heard the noise again. This time, it was louder, and it was followed by what sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. We both froze. "That doesn't sound like mice," Dan said, looking up at the ceiling. I shook my head. "No, that's something else." We had a discussion about it, and I finally convinced Dan that we needed to check it out. But, of course, we didn't want to deal with the mess of trying to get rid of an animal or something even worse up there, so we called an exterminator. They came out the next day and checked the attic. After a thorough inspection, the guy told us there were no signs of pests. No droppings, no chewed wires, nothing. He even said he couldn't find a single entrance point where animals could have gotten in. Dan and I were both relieved, but also a little unnerved. We hadn't imagined the noises. They were real, and now we were left with no explanation. Days passed, and the noises continued. Sometimes they were soft, like the rustling of fabric or something light brushing against the floor. Other times, it was more distinct, the sound of something heavy moving or even knocking. It was as if someone was up there, just walking around or making noise for no reason. But no one was up there. We began to avoid the attic altogether. There was no need to go up there anyway. It wasn't like we used it for anything. The only thing up there were old boxes from the previous owners, things they hadn't bothered to take when they moved out. Every time I'd hear a thump or a shuffle above, I'd just chalk it up to our imagination. But then things started to escalate. One night, around midnight, I was woken up by the sound of something hitting the floor upstairs. It was a loud, thudding noise that echoed throughout the house. Dan woke up, too, and we both lay there, listening. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, faint at first, like something being dragged across the floor, but then it got louder, more deliberate. I couldn't take it anymore. "Dan, we have to go check the attic," I said, my voice shaky with fear. Dan hesitated, looking up at the ceiling. "Maybe we should call the police." "I don't know what's going on, but I don't like it." I agreed. We didn't know what was happening, but we had to do something. We got up and grabbed a flashlight. As we climbed the stairs to the attic, the noise grew more distinct. It wasn't just dragging anymore. It sounded like something or someone was moving around up there, pacing back and forth. When we reached the attic door, Dan hesitated. The door was locked. That was odd. The previous owners had told us they hadn't locked it. It was just a wooden door with a simple latch, and we didn't even have a key for it. "Do you think someone's been up here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dan didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at the locked door. Then, without saying a word, he grabbed the latch and pulled. The door creaked open slowly, and the flashlight beam immediately revealed the room. At first, it looked empty. Dust hung in the air, and the piles of old boxes and junk were scattered all around. But then, I saw something strange, an overturned box near the corner of the room. The lid was slightly ajar, and something had clearly been moved. Dan stepped further into the room, shining the light over the space. That's when we both noticed it, footprints in the dust. The kind of prints you only leave when you've been walking around in a space for a while. My stomach dropped. We hadn't been up here in weeks, and yet these prints were fresh, too fresh to be from the previous owners. Someone had been here. Someone had been living here. I turned to Dan, my heart racing. "What the hell is going on?" Dan didn't answer. He just stepped further into the attic, moving toward the corner where the prints led. And that's when he saw it, an old, faded sleeping bag tucked behind some boxes. It was a bright red color, and I could see it had been used recently. The whole room smelled musty, but underneath that, there was a faint odor of food and sweat and something else I couldn't quite place. Dan knelt down beside the sleeping bag and lifted it, his hand shaking. Underneath was a small, worn-out backpack. And in the backpack, there were personal items that didn't belong to us. A few shirts, a water bottle, some old magazines, and a pair of worn-out shoes. It was clear someone had been living in this attic for weeks, maybe longer. My mind was racing. Who could it have been? Had someone been hiding up here all this time, waiting for the right moment to leave? Why hadn't we noticed? Before I could ask anything, I heard something else. A sound from behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing. The noise had stopped. We both stood there in silence, our eyes darting around the attic, trying to make sense of it all. Then, slowly, Dan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed the police and told them everything. They said they'd send someone over right away, but I knew we couldn't stay in the house alone, not anymore. We gathered our things quickly and left, not even bothering to lock the door behind us. When the police arrived, they searched the entire attic. They found more evidence that someone had been living there: blankets, a few more belongings, and a small pile of empty cans. It didn't make any sense. The police couldn't figure out who had been there or how they'd gotten in. There were no signs of forced entry, and the attic was sealed off with no windows. We ended up leaving that night, staying in a hotel until they could investigate further. They didn't find anyone still hiding in the attic, but the whole experience left us shaken. It was like someone had been quietly watching us, living in our house without us knowing. We had no idea how long it had been going on. And even now, when I hear the creaks of the floorboards late at night or the odd noises coming from upstairs, I still can't shake the feeling that someone's up there, watching. It started out like a regular stop. I was driving back from a long road trip, somewhere between exhausted and delirious from being in the car for hours. I pulled into a gas station just off the highway, hoping to stretch my legs and grab a drink. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was one of those typical, half-lit, low-key places where you'd stop just to fuel up and keep moving. The pumps were almost empty, with only a couple of other cars scattered around the lot. I parked near the front, ready to top off my tank and grab some snacks. The weather was a little overcast, the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel just a bit off. As I walked toward the door of the station, I noticed a man standing near one of the pumps. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a faded red jacket, a cap pulled low over his eyes, and jeans that looked like they'd seen better days. He gave me a friendly nod when he saw me, and I instinctively nodded back, though I wasn't really in the mood to chat. I'd been on the road for far too long and just wanted to get back home. But then he said something that made me stop in my tracks. "Hey, man, you look like you could use a wash." I stopped, frowning a little. Was he talking to me? I glanced at my car. It wasn't particularly dirty, but the long trip had left it a little dusty. Not enough to make me want to get a full wash, but enough to make me wonder if maybe it wouldn't hurt. "You sure you don't want a free wash while you're here?" he added. "Ah, free?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yep, free. Just trying to help out people like you on the road. Free wash, no strings attached." Something about it felt a little off, but at the same time, I figured it couldn't hurt. I had some time to kill, and if it was truly free, what was the worst that could happen? "All right," I said, pulling my keys out of my pocket. "Why not?" He gave me a smile that seemed almost too wide, like he was trying a bit too hard to seem friendly. Still, I didn't think much of it. I handed him my keys and started walking toward the convenience store to grab a drink. As I walked in, I could still see the man in my car, opening the door and starting to spray something on the windows. I didn't think it was weird at the time, but I should have been more cautious. It only took a minute before the unease started to creep in. I went straight to the cooler, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked up to the counter. The cashier gave me a look that I could only describe as uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just late and he was tired. But when I paid and turned around to head back outside, something felt wrong. The man with my car was gone. I froze, a chill running down my spine. My car was still there, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I glanced over at the other vehicles parked around the lot, but no one was paying attention. The gas station was still mostly empty. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe he was just washing my car in a different part of the lot. But my gut told me otherwise. I could feel my heart rate picking up. Something wasn't right. I started walking towards the exit, scanning the area for any sign of him. And then I saw it. The car. My car. It was moving. I saw it just as it sped out of the lot, tires screeching as it turned onto the highway. I froze. My legs felt like they were made of lead as the realization hit me. The man had stolen my car. I stood there, staring after it for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It was like a bad dream, something that didn't feel real. I'd been gone for just a few minutes. How could he have taken my car that quickly? I didn't know what to do. I wanted to chase after him, but my legs wouldn't move. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called the police. They stole my car, I said, my voice trembling. A man just took my car. I was only inside for a minute. I could hear the dispatcher trying to calm me down, asking for my location and the details of the car. But all I could think about was how quickly it had happened. How had he done it? Was he just waiting for someone to leave their car unattended? Did he know exactly what he was doing? I walked back to the pump, staring at the empty spot where my car had been parked. The whole scene felt surreal. A couple of minutes later, the police arrived. They asked me to explain what had happened. I told them everything I could remember, but it didn't seem like much. I'd been inside for maybe 5 minutes, tops. When I came out, the car was gone. One officer asked if there was anything valuable in the car, but I couldn't think of anything in the moment. It wasn't like I had a lot of personal things in there, but I realized I didn't even know what the man had been able to take before he drove off. They asked me to wait while they filed the report. I didn't want to stick around any longer, so I left the station and went back to my hotel, my mind racing the entire time. How had he been able to take my car so easily? Was it a setup? Was it the kind of thing he did every night, preying on tired, unsuspecting drivers? The next day, the police called me to say they found the car abandoned at the side of the road. The thief had left it there, empty. I didn't get the car back until a few days later, after they finished collecting evidence. By then, I'd already canceled my insurance and filed a report with the DMV, assuming the worst. I still think about it sometimes. How easy it was for him to approach me, how quickly he had my car in his possession, and how no one at the gas station seemed to have seen anything. I never did find out who that man was or what he really wanted. Maybe it was just a one-off, maybe it wasn't. But now, every time I stop at a gas station, I'm more cautious. I never let anyone touch my keys unless I'm absolutely sure who they are. I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning. We hired a tutor for our son a few months ago. He's 9, and while he's smart, he was falling behind in math and reading. My wife and I both work full-time, so we decided having someone come to the house would be easier than shuttling him back and forth to a learning center. We found Mark through an online service. His profile was impressive: years of experience, glowing reviews, even a background in child psychology. He seemed perfect. Mark came to meet us before his first session, and everything felt right. He was friendly, professional, and great with our son, Ethan. He stayed about an hour, discussing his approach and going over Ethan's needs. We felt confident leaving him with Ethan for the first session later that week. The lesson started off well. Ethan seemed to enjoy working with Mark, which was a relief. He even started bringing his math homework to the dinner table to show us what he'd learned. We were thrilled and thought we'd found the perfect fit. It wasn't until a few weeks in that things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle. Mark would ask questions that didn't seem related to tutoring. "Do you and your wife both work late?" he asked one evening as I walked into the door. I thought he was just making conversation, so I answered without much thought. Then, during another session, he casually asked if we had any travel plans coming up. Again, I didn't think much of it. People ask those kinds of questions all the time. But then he started asking Ethan similar things. "What time does your mom usually get home? Do you ever stay home by yourself?" Ethan mentioned it to us one night, laughing because he thought the questions were weird. My wife and I exchanged a look but decided not to jump to conclusions. Maybe Mark was just trying to connect with Ethan, we thought. Then small items began to go missing. It was little things at first: loose change from the counter, a pack of gum, a cheap pen set my wife kept near the phone. We joked about it, blaming each other or Ethan. "Stop stealing my pens," my wife said, laughing. Ethan swore he hadn't touched them, and I believed him. But then the missing items started to add up. A set of spare keys we kept in the kitchen drawer vanished. A pair of earrings my wife left on the bathroom sink disappeared. Even one of my watches, a cheap one I wore for work, was gone. We turned the house upside down looking for these things but found nothing. It wasn't until my wife noticed her jewelry box slightly out of place on her dresser that we started to piece things together. The box wasn't where she usually left it, and when she opened it, she swore a necklace was missing. "I think Mark might be stealing from us," she said one night after Ethan had gone to bed. I wanted to dismiss it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. He was the only person who'd been in the house regularly besides us. But why? He didn't seem like the type. He was polite, punctual, and great with Ethan. What motive could he possibly have? We decided to test our theory. The next time Mark came over, we left a few $20 bills on the kitchen counter, partially hidden under some mail. We made sure to step out of the room a couple of times during the session, giving him the opportunity to take them. After he left, we checked. The money was gone. My stomach dropped. My wife was livid. We wanted to confront him right away, but we were also nervous about making accusations without solid proof. What if we were wrong? What if Ethan got caught in the middle of something ugly? We decided to install a small camera in the living room where most of the tutoring sessions took place. It was discreet, hidden among some books on the shelf. We figured if he was taking anything, we'd catch him in the act. The next session, we acted like everything was normal. Mark came in, greeted Ethan, and started the lesson while we pretended to work in the other room. After he left, we immediately checked the footage. What we saw made my blood run cold. Mark wasn't just tutoring. While Ethan was focused on his workbook, Mark kept glancing around the room, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. At one point, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook. He started writing in it, looking up occasionally at Ethan and around the room. When Ethan got up to use the bathroom, Mark stood and started walking around the living room. He opened a cabinet, rifled through some papers, and even peeked into a box we kept on the shelf. He didn't take anything this time, at least not that we could see, but the intent was clear. He was snooping. We were furious, but also scared. What was he looking for? Was he planning to steal more? Or worse? We decided to call the police. They advised us to cancel the next session and avoid confrontation. They'd come to the house to take a report and review the footage. When we told Mark we wouldn't need his services anymore, his reaction chilled me. He didn't argue or ask why. He just smiled and said, "I understand. If you ever change your mind, feel free to reach out." The police came the next day and took our statement. They said they'd look into Mark's background and see if he'd been reported for similar behavior. In the meantime, we changed our locks and added security cameras around the house. We also warned Ethan never to open the door to anyone he didn't know, even if they claimed to be a friend. A few days later, the police called with an update. Mark had a record, nothing major, just a few misdemeanors for theft and trespassing. But it was enough to confirm our suspicions. They said they'd try to locate him for questioning, but didn't think we were in immediate danger. Still, I can't shake the feeling that we dodged a bullet. Every time I hear a car pull into the driveway or see someone walking past the house, my heart races. I can't help but wonder what might have happened if we hadn't noticed the signs. We're more careful now, especially about who we let into our home. Ethan's doing fine, he's caught up in school and doesn't seem too bothered by what happened. But my wife and I can't stop thinking about how close we came to letting a stranger into our lives who clearly had his own agenda. We never heard from Mark again, and honestly, I hope we never do. It was just another late night at the office. I had so much work to finish and thought it would be easier to just stay in the empty building instead of trying to get it all done the next day. The quiet was kind of nice, actually. I could focus without the usual distractions. Everyone else had already gone home, so I thought I'd have the place to myself for a few hours. I don't usually stay late. But the pressure from my boss had been intense, and this project had a tight deadline. I was an intern, so I had to prove myself. The dim lighting of the office made it easier to concentrate, the soft hum of the computers and the occasional sound of paper shuffling keeping me company. At least, that's what I thought. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. The security lights in the hallway flickered. They never did that before. I thought it was just the wiring or some minor issue with the lights. I went back to my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, like a presence that wasn't supposed to be there. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone was watching me, but every time I turned around, I was alone. Then, I heard it. A faint noise. A rustling. I froze, straining to listen. It was coming from the hallway. My heart raced, and I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the cleaning crew was still around. But no, it was much too late for that. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the door, trying to peek into the hallway. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. When the lights came back on, there was no sign of anyone. I figured it was just a power surge, nothing to worry about. But then I heard footsteps. Soft, slow steps. They echoed down the hallway, just faint enough that I wasn't sure if I was hearing things. I quickly looked over at the hallway exit, hoping someone would walk past. But nobody did. The footsteps kept coming closer, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of someone's breathing. My stomach dropped. This was wrong. I slowly backed away from the door, trying not to make any noise. I grabbed my phone, ready to call security if I had to, but before I could press the number, the door creaked open. I didn't know who it was at first. They stepped into the light just enough for me to see the outline of a person, but their face was hidden in shadow. I froze, hoping they would just go away, but they didn't. "Hey," a voice called out, rough and tired. "It's me." I didn't recognize the voice, but something about it was familiar. It took me a moment before the person stepped closer, and I could see their face. It was Matt. Matt was one of the senior employees in the marketing department, but he'd been fired weeks ago. He had left the company under strange circumstances, and I'd heard rumors about it. He'd been a bit odd, but nobody ever really talked about what had happened. He just stopped showing up one day. Matt was standing in front of me now, wearing an old company t-shirt, his hair disheveled. His eyes were wide, as if he hadn't slept in days. I could see that he was sweaty, his clothes wrinkled. But there was something off about him, something wasn't right. I backed away, unsure of what to say. "Matt, what are you doing here?" My voice was shaky. He didn't respond at first. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes darting around the office. "I've been here for a while. Been working, you know," he said, his voice flat. I just didn't want to leave. I felt my chest tighten. "Matt, you can't be here. You don't work here anymore. The building is closed. You need to go." He didn't seem to hear me. He just stood there, staring at me like I wasn't even speaking. Then he started walking toward me, slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't need to leave," he said, his voice taking on more menacing edge. "I like it here. I like the quiet. I don't want anyone to find out, but they'll understand. They'll all understand." My blood ran cold. Something was terribly wrong. I had to leave. I turned toward the exit, but before I could make it, he stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You shouldn't go anywhere," he said, his voice low. "It's safer here. I don't want to be alone anymore." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified. This wasn't Matt anymore. Whoever this was, it wasn't the same person I had known. His demeanor had shifted, and I could feel it. The air around me seemed heavier now. "Matt, please," I said, my voice almost a whisper. "You need help. I'm calling security. I'm calling someone." I reached for my phone again, but before I could dial, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. I yelped and tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I don't want anyone else here. I don't want to go back." The look in his eyes was something I couldn't explain, wild, desperate. There was no rationality there, just a kind of crazed desperation. My mind raced, and I thought of every possible way to get away, but I knew I had to act fast. I had to get out of there, and I had to get away from him. I twisted my arm free, shoving him back as hard as I could. He stumbled, but he didn't fall. I ran for the nearest exit, my feet pounding against the floor. I didn't stop until I was outside the building, gasping for breath. I didn't look back. I just ran. I stayed in the parking lot, trembling, until the security guard came to check on me. I don't know what Matt's intentions were, but I never went back to that office building after that night. I found a new internship elsewhere, and I didn't even tell anyone about what happened. I couldn't. Every time I drive past that building, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. What if I hadn't left when I did? What was he really planning? All I know is that I'm glad I'm not there anymore. And I pray I never have to face Matt again. I've been debating whether or not to share this for months. I'm not the type to post stuff like this, but the more I think about it, the more I feel like someone else needs to hear it. Maybe it'll help someone avoid what I went through. It started on Wednesday evening. I was on my way home from work, driving down a quiet stretch of highway. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to getting back to my apartment. The sun had just set, and the road was mostly empty. I had the radio on low, kind of zoning out, when I saw the lights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was on a highway, and there are a lot of police around, so it seemed normal. But then I noticed something odd. The lights weren't the usual red and blue I was used to seeing from real police cars. They were a little dimmer, almost orange. And the car wasn't a patrol car, at least, not one I recognized. It was a plain, dark sedan, and the headlights were unusually bright, almost blinding. I checked my speed. I wasn't speeding, at least I didn't think I was. But I decided to pull over anyway. Better to be safe than sorry. I switched on my hazard lights and slowed to a stop on the side of the road. My mind was still racing, trying to figure out why I'd been pulled over when I hadn't done anything wrong. The car behind me stopped, and I saw the figure in my rearview mirror. The person walking up to my car was wearing a police uniform, but something about him felt off. It wasn't just the lights or the car, it was his presence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark blue shirt and a bulletproof vest, the kind I've seen officers wear. But he didn't have a badge on his shirt, which I thought was strange. And the way he was walking, kind of stiff, like he was trying to appear more official than he really was. He reached my window, and I cracked it just enough to hear him. "License and registration, please," he said in a calm, almost rehearsed voice. He didn't sound rude, just neutral. Like he was reading a script. I asked him why I was being pulled over, and he gave me a vague answer about routine checks and safety. That didn't sit right with me. I asked him again if I had done something wrong, and he just repeated the same thing, barely looking at me. I handed over my license and registration because I didn't want to argue. But the whole situation felt off. As he walked back to his car, I sat there, staring at the dashboard. Something in my gut told me this wasn't right. The lights, the car, his behavior, it wasn't adding up. I looked around. There weren't any other cars on the road. No other police vehicles, no other signs of authority. Just me, parked on the side of a dark highway with a guy who, at this point, could have been anyone. I thought about driving off, but I didn't want to escalate things. I mean, I wasn't exactly sure what I'd be dealing with. So, I stayed put. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching as he stood by his car, talking into a radio or something, but his back was to me. His posture was stiff, and for a moment, I thought I saw him glance at me. I don't know why, but that made me feel even more uneasy. When he came back to my car, he handed me my registration and license and told me to stay put. His tone had changed now, it was sharper, more commanding. He asked me to step out of the car, which struck me as odd. I wasn't sure if I should, but then he said something about standard procedure, and I didn't want to seem uncooperative. I got out of my car, but as soon as I stood up, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Something in his eyes told me I was in danger. I took a step back, my mind running through every possible scenario. He wasn't acting like a normal cop. There was no cruiser, no real reason for me to get out of my car, and my gut told me I shouldn't trust him. He told me to turn around and face the car, and I did. But as I stood there, I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I was getting more anxious, and I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I fight back? My hands were shaking, but I stayed still, listening to every little sound around me. Then, without warning, I heard him say, "You're going to have to come with me." His voice was low, almost like a whisper, but it carried a tone that I knew meant he wasn't giving me a choice. I spun around, facing him. My heart was racing, my mind screaming that something was wrong, but I couldn't move. He was standing there, close, too close, and I could see the slight smirk on his face. That's when I knew for sure this wasn't a real cop. Before I could react, he reached for something under his vest, pulling out what looked like a badge, but it was too shiny, too new, like something someone had bought at a costume store. I don't even think it was a real badge, but it didn't matter. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, and I took a step back, hoping my instincts would save me. He reached out, and that's when I saw it, a second figure, coming out from behind the sedan. A woman, tall and thin, wearing a black jacket. She had no badge, no uniform. Just a plain black hoodie, and she was walking toward me with purpose. "Get in the car," the man said again, his voice now hard. "This is your last warning." I don't know what made me do it, but I turned around and ran. I don't know how I moved so fast, but I sprinted toward my car, slamming the door open. I was shaking, my heart in my throat, but I didn't think. I just reacted. The engine roared to life, and I sped off before I even fully closed the door. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing there, watching me. The man didn't move, but the woman just stared, and I knew in that moment that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest gas station. I pulled into the lot, my hands still shaking, and I called the police. When I explained what had happened, they told me that there had been no reported officer on the road in that area. No one fitting the description of the person I'd encountered. It's been weeks, and I still can't shake the feeling of those eyes on me. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know I was lucky to get away. I've thought about it every day since then, and the more I think about it, the more I feel like I barely made it out alive. The hike started out normal. It was me and my best friend, Kevin, on a weekend trip to a national park we've been talking about for months. We planned a 2-night trek through some of the quieter trails. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a way to get away from work and all the noise of daily life. The first day went smooth. We made it to the campsite early, set up the tent, and had plenty of time to relax by the fire. The trail wasn't too crowded, and we only passed a few groups along the way. It felt peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't really get in the city. The second morning, as we were packing up to move to the next site, a group of 4 people came through. 2 guys, 2 women. They looked about our age, maybe a little older. Their gear was worn, like they'd done this kind of thing before, and they were friendly enough at first. One of the guys, tall with a shaved head, called out a greeting, and they stopped to chat. Kevin's always more social than me, so he did most of the talking. They asked where we were headed, how long we'd been out, all the usual stuff. I thought it was fine, but something about the way they kept glancing at our gear put me on edge. Like they were sizing it up. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. After a few minutes, they said goodbye and continued down the trail. Kevin waved, and we finished packing. It wasn't until we got moving that I realized they were going the same direction we were. We catch glimpses of them ahead, their voices carrying through the trees, but we kept our distance. When we reached our next site, they were already there. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a clearing by a stream, but it was big enough for multiple groups. They waved when they saw us, and Kevin waved back. I wasn't thrilled about sharing the space, but it's public land, and we didn't have much choice. As we set up our tent, the group came over again. They were still friendly, offering us some of their trail mix and asking if we needed help with anything. The tall guy, he introduced himself as Jay, even complimented Kevin's tent, saying it looked sturdy. I just nodded along, keeping my answers short. Something about them felt off. Too nice, maybe. Like they were trying too hard. That night, we ate our dinner and sat by our own fire, trying to keep to ourselves. The other group set up a little farther away, but they were loud, laughing and talking like they were at a party. It didn't bother Kevin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching us. When we woke up the next morning, I found one of our water bottles was missing. I thought maybe Kevin had moved it, but he swore he hadn't touched it. It didn't make sense. We packed everything up before bed. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't help thinking about the other group. We packed up and started the last leg of the hike. The trail was harder that day, with more steep climbs and rocky paths. About an hour in, Kevin's bootlace snapped. It wasn't a huge deal, but he swore it had been fine the night before. We stopped so he could fix it, and while we were sitting there, the other group caught up to us. Jay grinned and asked if we needed help again. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on our packs, and I felt my skin crawl. One of the women, short, with curly hair, offered Kevin some duct tape for his boot. He thanked her, and they moved on, disappearing down the trail. We started walking again, and I kept replaying everything in my head. The missing water bottle. Kevin's bootlace. Little things, but they didn't sit right. I told Kevin, but he shrugged it off, saying I was paranoid. Maybe he was right, but I couldn't relax. Around midday, we stopped for a break at a small clearing. I opened my pack to grab a snack and found my food bag had been opened. Not all of it was gone, but enough to notice. Kevin's bag was untouched, and he looked at me like I was losing it when I pointed it out. Probably a raccoon, he said, brushing crumbs off his pants. But my bag had been inside my pack, zipped up tight. There was no way an animal had gotten to it without making a mess. We kept walking, and the trail got narrower, with thick trees on either side. I started to notice the sounds of footsteps behind us. Light, like someone trying to be quiet. I stopped a few times, pretending to adjust my pack, but I didn't see anyone. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. By late afternoon, we reached the last site. It was more isolated than the others, surrounded by woods on three sides. The stream was dry, which made me even more nervous. We were low on water, thanks to the missing bottle, and the next source was miles away. As we set up camp, I kept scanning the trees, expecting the other group to show up again. They didn't, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I told Kevin we should leave, but he laughed, saying I was overreacting. That night, as we were falling asleep, I heard voices outside the tent. Low, murmuring voices, too far away to make out but close enough to know they were there. I shook Kevin awake, but by the time he listened, the voices had stopped. He told me it was just the wind and rolled over. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, circling the tent. Slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. After what felt like forever, the steps faded, and I finally dozed off. When we woke up, the tent stakes were missing. The whole thing had collapsed on one side. Kevin cursed, saying it must have been animals again, but I knew better. Someone had pulled them out while we were sleeping. We packed up in record time and started hiking back toward the car. I felt exposed, like eyes were on us the whole way. Kevin tried to lighten the mood, joking about my wild imagination, but I could tell he was uneasy too. About a mile from the parking lot, we found one of our missing water bottles on the side of the trail. It was empty, the cat lying a few feet away. Kevin stopped laughing after that. We didn't see the other group again, but I couldn't shake the feeling they were watching us, just out of sight. When we finally reached the car, I felt like I could breathe again. We threw our gear in the trunk and didn't stop driving until we were hours away from the park. I don't know what they wanted or why they were messing with us, but I haven't gone camping since. Every time I think about it, I get this sinking feeling, like we'd barely made it out. Like they were testing how far they could push us. And I don't want to know what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance for the group to escape the noise of city life and get back to nature. There were 5 of us, me, my brother, his girlfriend, my best friend, and her cousin. Nothing special, just a weekend hike into some remote area. We'd been planning it for months, picking out a spot we thought would be quiet and secluded. None of us were expecting anything to go wrong. We were just looking forward to some time by the fire, some good food, and maybe a few hikes through the woods. The first day went off without a hitch. We set up camp at a small clearing near a creek, made a fire, and spent the evening talking, cooking dinner, and drinking a little. The place was perfect, quiet, private, just far enough off the trail to feel like we were really away from everything. The forest felt peaceful, even a little magical. At least, that's how I saw it then. But things started to feel off on the second day. We woke up to the sound of birds, but there was something wrong with the quiet. It wasn't the usual kind of quiet you expect in nature, where it's just peaceful and calm. It felt too still, like the air was holding its breath. Still, we brushed it off, made some breakfast, and headed out for a hike. It was a long walk, more than we had planned, but none of us really cared. We were all in good spirits, just enjoying the fresh air. When we got back to camp around late afternoon, something felt strange. The whole area around the clearing seemed darker, even though it was still light outside. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just felt uneasy. We went about setting up for dinner, but it was hard to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just the tiredness setting in. After we ate, my brother and I decided to take a walk to stretch our legs and clear our heads. The rest of the group stayed by the fire, talking and laughing. It was just a short walk down the trail that led back to the road where we parked. We weren't going to leave camp, just wander a little to get some fresh air. That's when we saw it. About half a mile down the trail, right where the road met the wooded area, there was a gate, rusted, heavy, and completely out of place. It was blocking the path, completely shutting off the only way out. We both stopped dead in our tracks when we saw it. It wasn't there when we first arrived, not even close. We had walked down this same path that morning, and there had been nothing. The road was wide open, just like it should be. But now, in front of us, was a tall, metal gate that looked like it had been there for decades. I thought it was some sort of private property gate, maybe someone who lived nearby had put it up. My brother suggested it was an old hunting camp or a ranch that used to be around, but I didn't buy it. Something about it didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, like it had been placed there specifically to block us in. We tried to push on the gate, but it was locked, and there were no signs, no markings, nothing to explain why it was there. We looked around for any kind of indication of who might own it, but the woods were completely silent. No houses, no roads, nothing. Just the endless trees on all sides. After a few minutes of trying to figure out how to get through, we decided to head back to camp and tell the others. As we walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods around us seemed so quiet, but I kept hearing small sounds of branches cracking, the rustle of leaves. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like something was just out of view, lurking. When we got back to the campsite, we told the others about the gate. At first, they didn't believe us. They thought it was some kind of mistake or maybe a prank. But when we walked them down the trail to show them, the gate was still there. We all stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. The sunlight was fading fast, and the whole place suddenly felt darker, colder. None of us really knew what to do. We had no way of contacting anyone since we didn't have cell service, and the gate was the only way out. We couldn't just stay here forever. So, we all decided to sleep on it and figure things out in the morning. We made sure to lock up the tent and keep the fire going, but no one felt at ease. Everyone kept glancing at the gate, the darkening woods beyond, like they were expecting something to happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds in the woods outside the tent were off, almost like something or someone was moving around. I kept hearing footsteps, faint at first, then closer. I thought maybe it was just an animal, but then I realized that these footsteps didn't sound like they were coming from the usual direction. They were too slow, too deliberate. And they seemed to stop when I tried to listen more closely, as if someone was standing perfectly still, waiting for me to look. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Every time I almost drifted off, I'd hear them again, just outside the tent. I got up to check the fire, but it was still going strong. No one else was awake. Everything was quiet again, but I felt it. There was something wrong. In the morning, we packed up our things, trying to figure out what to do. We couldn't just leave the way we came. The gate was still there, locked in place. And there was no way around it. The road behind us was blocked by a thick wall of trees, with no visible way through. We debated for a while on whether to try climbing the gate, but it was too high, and there was no way to know who might be on the other side. After a few hours, we finally made the decision to head deeper into the woods, hoping we could find another way out. But when we turned back onto the main trail, we were met with something even worse. The gate wasn't the only thing blocking us anymore. The whole trail seemed to have been altered, like someone or something had intentionally moved things to keep us from leaving. Rocks were piled up, branches were snapped and laid across the path, and the trees themselves seemed to loom closer, more menacing. I'm not sure how to explain it, but there was no mistaking it. We were being trapped. That's when we realized that someone, or something, didn't want us to leave. The whole experience was so unsettling, and it was clear that we weren't just dealing with a simple gate that had been put up for some unknown reason. Whoever or whatever was out there was making sure we stayed put. We never found out who was behind it all. After hours of wandering the woods, trying every possible path, we managed to find a back trail that led us to a neighboring road. We made it out, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, waiting for us to slip up. Every sound, every crack of a twig, every rustle in the trees made my heart race. I don't know if we were just unlucky or if it was something more, but I'll never forget that locked gate or the feeling of being trapped out there, helpless, with no idea who or what was keeping us from leaving. And I'll never go back to that place again. I had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to getting home. The train schedule was messed up again, so I decided to get a rideshare instead. I pulled up my app, entered my destination, and ordered the ride. I was tired and didn't think much about it. The car showed up fairly quickly, and I got in. The driver didn't say much when I hopped in, just nodded and started driving. I sat back and opened my phone to catch up on some messages. The car seemed to be moving in the right direction at first. But after a few turns, I started to feel like we weren't heading toward my neighborhood anymore. I looked up. The streetlights were becoming sparse, and the roads were getting quieter. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself maybe there was just some traffic or a detour. but after a few more minutes, I couldn't ignore it. We were definitely getting farther from where I needed to go. I sat up and asked, "Hey, are you sure you're going the right way?" I tried to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in my voice. The driver didn't respond right away. He kept his eyes on the road, hands firmly gripping the wheel. The streetlights were now almost non-existent, and I could barely see anything outside the window. It felt like we were driving through some industrial area. "Hey," I said again, this time a little louder. "Where are we going?" "You're not going the right way." The driver glanced in the rearview mirror but didn't speak. That's when I started to feel a knot forming in my stomach. I pressed the button to unlock the door, planning to get out. But when I reached for the handle, I realized the child lock was on. I tried to stay calm, but the car was now on a deserted road, with only a few faint lights off in the distance. I was pretty sure we were nowhere near my place. I started to feel panic creeping in. "Pull over. I don't want to go any farther. Stop the car right now." The driver didn't answer. He just kept driving, his expression never changing. It was like he didn't hear me at all. I was starting to feel trapped. I looked at my phone. The app showed we were getting farther from my destination, but there wasn't much signal. The screen kept freezing, and the map was taking forever to load. I tried to call the ride service, but the call wouldn't go through. "Can you just stop?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm serious. I don't feel comfortable. Pull over now." Still nothing. I glanced over at the driver. He was wearing some kind of uniform, but I didn't recognize it. His face was expressionless. I couldn't tell if he was trying to look calm or if he was just blank. I started feeling that gut-wrenching sense of something being terribly wrong. I quickly scanned the area outside the window again. There were no cars around. No signs of life. I wasn't even sure which direction we were going at this point. I reached for my phone again and tried to message someone, but it was useless. The signal was completely gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed hard on the door handle, but it didn't budge. I tried to pull the handle again, even harder, but it was useless. The door was locked. My heart started racing. My head was spinning. I felt trapped, and every time I looked at the driver, he wouldn't even acknowledge me. It was like I wasn't even there. I took a deep breath and told myself not to panic. I had to figure this out. I looked around the car, trying to think of something, anything that might give me a clue about what was happening. There was nothing. No signs, no help, no way out. I turned to the driver again. "Stop the car," I said, my voice trembling now. "Please, stop the car." The driver didn't even glance at me this time. He just kept his eyes forward, his expression cold. I had to do something, or I was never going to get out of here. In a split second, I made up my mind. I reached for the door handle again, but this time, I did something different. I grabbed the sleeve of my jacket and used it to protect my hand. I yanked the handle with everything I had. This time, it gave. The door popped open. Before the car could slow down, I didn't think twice. I just shoved myself out of the seat and pushed myself out of the moving car. My legs hit the ground hard, and I stumbled but kept moving. I had no idea where I was, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. The car didn't stop. I could hear it speeding off into the distance, and I didn't look back. I don't remember how long I ran for, but I finally made it to a lit street. There were a few houses nearby. I knocked on the first door I saw, and luckily, The person inside was kind enough to let me use their phone. I called for another ride, explained what had happened, and waited for help. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been able to get out of that car. I still don't know who the driver was or what his intentions were. I don't want to think about it. But I'll never forget the way he ignored me, the way he didn't even acknowledge my presence. It felt like I was invisible to him, and that's what scared me the most. I still take ride shares, but I'm a lot more careful now. I never take anything for granted. And I always check that my door is unlocked. Always.